This is a real experience that happened to me and my family. To give some background, we are Navajo, and I was about 10 years old at the time of this encounter. My family is living with my grandparents in Arizona. It is me, my mom, dad, and a little brother. On this one night, we get a knock on our door. It is around 8 p.m., and it happens to be the local sheriff. He says that my father's mom and his brother, my uncle, were in a bad car accident. My mom and dad run out the door and leave me and my little brother with my other grandma. My grandfather is away in Kingman. My little brother and I have trouble falling asleep, so my grandma lights a lamp and just sits there knitting and singing songs in Navajo. When all of a sudden, we hear the hounds start making noises, and in the distance, far away, what sounds like a flute being played. At the time, I remember thinking nothing of it and resumed playing with my brother. I would say it's around 10:30 p.m. by that time. As we're sitting there playing, the noises sound like they are getting closer. The hounds outside are barking loud and starting to sound more urgent. My grandma doesn't seem to be bothered by any of these noises, but my little brother and I are pretty shaken up. The hounds keep at it pretty steady for a good hour or so, and then all of a sudden stop. A little after midnight, as my brother and I are asleep, there is a knock on the front door. I wake up thinking it is my parents, so I jump up and run to the door. But just before I reach it, my grandma yells for me to get away. I freeze in my tracks. She never raises her voice without a reason. She then yells at the door in Navajo, "Who's there?" But there is no answer. She yells again, and this time, the knock on the door is louder and more impatient. My grandma sits back down on her chair and says firmly, but in a calm tone, "Go away. We don't want you here. Leave us alone." Whoever it is starts to pound on the door. I run back to my grandmother, and by this time, my little brother is up too. All of a sudden, the hounds start to bark again, louder than ever. The knocking stops, and it is replaced by a thumping noise up on the roof, as if someone, or something, is walking across the top of the house. Then, there is a loud thump, as if something heavy hits the porch. There, outside the window, which is covered by a thin white curtain, rises up a dark figure. But it doesn't have the form of a man. It is like a large animal walking on 2 feet. It starts to push on the window pane. I think for sure it is going to break, but it stops and moves away. Seconds later, the doorknob to the front door is turning back and forth, the thing outside pushing and pulling, as if trying to open the door by force. My little brother and I are crying, but my grandmother, as calm as ever, starts singing and praying in Navajo. Everything stops and goes silent. Moments later, light pours through the front windows of the house, and we hear a car come up the drive. This time, it is my parents. Many years later, when I was older, my other grandmother told me that a skinwalker had a score to settle with my family and had come for my little brother and me. However, it didn't count on my grandmother being so strong in her faith and wise in the ways of our ancestors. To this day, I truly think this skinwalker is still after us. I still get nightmares when I hear whistling in the distance or see dark and strange forms in the trees. But when I do, I just pray and tell them to leave me be, and they go away. In 1987, my family and I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, a nice place, smaller than most cities, but interesting. The people there were kind, at least in the inner city. In the neighborhood where my family had moved, everyone was quiet and kept to themselves. Real quaint if you were the type of person who liked those kind of things. For me, I found it odd no one talked to my family or bothered to communicate while we were staying there. It was like they were hiding some kind of secret. But I did notice one thing. No one came near the house. At first I thought I understood why. The house wasn't exactly in good shape, if you know what I mean. The walls outside were rusted. The grass outside was tall and filled with bushes, and the place looked like a dump. But after a while, I started to notice things. People on the streets wouldn't come near the house at all. They acted as if it was going to devour them or something. Kids on the street would point and stare, and eventually, after I started school, I learned just why the people there were so afraid of our house. You know that place is haunted. That's the first thing someone said to me as I stepped into the school. Not even a single hello or a welcome. No, I got nothing of that. At first I was a bit confused. What's haunted? I said to the kid in front of me, the one who decided to make that statement. He didn't say anything. He just turned around and started walking away. I was a bit curious now. I wonder if what that kid said was true, or if it was just some kind of prank, something to pull on the new kid. But I was very wrong. I now know. School went on for a while, and everything seemed fine. My father and mother were happy. My sister, she was happy as well. But I noticed things started to happen to me. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a heavy feeling on my chest. It was as if something was laying on top of me or pressing against my body. But when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. During those nights, I swore I was being watched, as if someone was stalking me. There was this dark corner in my room that would appear every night. It was the only part of my room that was invisible during the nighttime. It was from that corner that I felt something watching me, as if someone was standing there. But I was too afraid to ever go and check. Not to mention, I was always very tired, and I tried to shrug it off and sleep, until one night, that is. As I laid in bed that night, I was having trouble sleeping as usual. That heavy feeling on my chest had returned, and it was getting hard for me to breathe. I had this feeling of overwhelming fear, but I didn't know why. It was like I was fearing for my dear life without any reason. My eyes were open slightly, and as I gazed around the room, I swore I saw the shadows moving in the moonlight, zooming past my vision as if they were getting closer and closer. Eventually, the shadows formed into what appeared to be a man in a dark, long cloak. I then woke up fully. I took a deep breath and I backed up against the wall behind my bed. But after that, I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed or something. Whatever that thing was, that man was coming closer. It sat down on my bed and it began to crawl towards me. I saw its dark hands press against my covers. The fingers resembled claws of some sort, but that wasn't its most terrifying feature. It had no face, no eyes. It was just darkness, a living shadow. I was panicking now. It kept coming closer and closer until it was in my face. You know, my parents always told me to pray when I felt scared, that God would answer my prayers and protect me. Well, he must have forgotten about me this time, because no amount of prayer whatsoever seemed to be helping. This thing was in my face. Its hands were reaching out, and just as it touched my face, it spoke in the deepest, darkest voice I had ever heard. I couldn't make out what it said. It was speaking in some kind of odd language, but even if it spoke English, I doubt I would have listened. I was too scared. too shaken up to pay attention. This thing spoke to me for I don't know how long, its dark, shadowy figure looming over me as it trailed its claw-like finger across my cheek, cutting into my skin slightly as some blood leaked down into my shirt. I thought this was it. I really thought I was going to die that night. However, I heard a knock at my door. I was relieved in some ways, but I was still scared that this thing was sitting on top of me, and for all I knew, it was about to eat or kill me or something. After the third knock, my mother walked into the room and she looked over at me. She couldn't see anything. I guess she acted like I wasn't there, as if I wasn't in my room. Maybe that thing on top of me blocked her view. I really don't know, but all hope was drained from my body at that very moment. I figured this was it. I was done for. But in the blink of an eye, I saw that thing get off me. It walked back to the spot where it first formed, and it began to change. My mother had left the room by now, but I was more focused on what this thing was turning into. For a moment, it looked as if I was staring into a silhouette of myself. The creature, the man, this being, whatever it was, it then waved to me, its still dark and shadowy body fading into a black mist. I didn't stay in that room. I got up, I ran downstairs, and I slept on the couch, with every light on possible. The next morning, I awoke early, before everyone else. I packed some clothes, small food, and some extra cash that my father had left in a jar on top of the fridge. I wrote a small note detailing what happened on the counter in the kitchen. Then I left, and I never looked back. I was 17 at the time, but mentally, I felt much older. I eventually crossed state lines, going back to my home state of Texas, where I got a job as a clerk in some crappy little convenience store on the south side of Dallas. Times were tough, but I pushed through. To be honest, I had been wanting to leave home for a long time. I just needed a reason to do it. In some fucked up way, I guess what happened was that reason. But looking back, I never did hear from my family again. I sent them letters, pictures, but nothing. I never got anything back. I figured they either forgot about me or they simply just didn't care. It wasn't until recently that I began to research on what happened that night. I had been having odd dreams lately. It seemed that this strange, heavy feeling on my chest had returned. I didn't know why, but I felt that if this thing was coming back for me, I wanted to know what it was. I then visited the local library, but I didn't find much interest. The closest I came to anything was an old Navajo legend called yenaglooshi. Apparently, it was a demonic force, or a person that would assume the shape of animals or people. It seemed logical, but I couldn't understand what such a thing would want with me. I was scared. I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, until someone I hadn't seen in a very long time showed up at my door. My mother. She was happy to see me, but she didn't seem that different since when I last saw her. Now mind you, I hadn't seen her for 25 years. I found it a bit odd that she still looked so young, but I shrugged it off. I was happy to see her. So very happy. We talked for a while, but something was off. Every time she looked at me, I got this cold feeling in my body. I felt as if I was staring at a different person. And after a while, I began to feel weak. I was tired. I hadn't slept for days. So I just went up to my room. Before that, however, my mother was telling me how my father left not long after I did, and that he took my sister with her. It was shocking, but I didn't care so much. I just wanted to sleep. But as I lay down in my bed, that feeling returned. That very same feeling I hadn't felt in 25 years. Someone is watching me from the corner of my room. I'm trying not to pay attention. I'm simply going to turn over and close my eyes. I'm not sure though if I'll make it through this night. I Don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you do, please find my family, inform them of what happened here. The journal of John F. Moncada was found thrown in the corner of his room by police earlier this month. He was laying in his bed, calm and lifeless, when they arrived. After examining his journal, police determined that the man had been up for a week or so before he eventually died from a heart attack. They also suspect that the man was hallucinating before he died, as the woman he claimed to be his mother was never there. In fact, she died 23 years ago in a house fire, along with the rest of his family. Strange, his bedroom window was open when the police arrived, and many neighbors claimed they saw a dark figure emerge a few nights ago. Even though there's little proof other than the witnesses' reports, the mirror in his bathroom, however, the police found many strange symbols carved into the glass, those of which were later translated from the Navajo language. There was one word, and it was burden. Police aren't sure if it holds any relevance to what happened here, but the case is now officially closed. My grandmother, on my mother's side, has always been very superstitious. For lack of a better word, she's not religious, but she does believe in a lot of the paranormal stuff. Her mom was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. Either way, she had never been anywhere east of Montana, and she grew up in Nevada. One year, when I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the visit was pretty uneventful. Typical boring old people stuff. Except she always kept her curtains drawn shut and would always peek out the window. And when someone asked what she was doing, she would simply reply, "Yenaglooshi is watching me." This went on for almost the entire visit, until a few days before we were about to leave. My grandma and my baby brother, he's 19 now, were in the front yard that evening. They were planting flowers when all of a sudden, my grandmother starts shouting, "Get away from that creature. It's not safe." Of course, being in Nevada, we all assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake. So we all run outside to see my grandmother clutching my little brother and shaking in terror against the side of the house. Standing out in the yard was a large, black, Great Dane-sized dog. It was staring at my grandmother with an intense look I had never seen before. It looked up at us, gave a little huff, and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but I do remember it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what happened, she kept repeating, "Yenaglooshi has found me." She then moved a couple weeks after that. I want to start the story off by saying that I am Navajo. I live in Utah, and growing up, my family never mentioned skinwalkers or witches to me, so I know nothing about them. My grandpa died just before the summer, so my parents sent me to live with my grandma to help her around her ranch. For company, I brought my cat along with me. He was an orange tabby. We had only been there 2 weeks when my cat went missing. I figured that he would come back, but he never did. I called him and looked for him, but nothing. A few days later, I was bringing some hay out behind the barn when something orange caught my eye. It was the remains of my cat. By the looks of it, he was attacked by something, most likely a coyote. They're all around here. However, when I picked it up, I used a pitchfork, and I immediately noticed that there were no bones. It was just a pile of skin and fur, but I also noticed that there were small splotches of what seemed to be red, yellow, and white paint. At first I thought he might have gotten into something, but the way the paint was on his fur, if you told me someone had put it there on purpose, I'm not sure you would be wrong. Even though there wasn't much left to him, I did love him, and I was heartbroken. So I put his remains in a wood box that my grandmother had in the barn and buried him behind a hill. I marked his final resting spot with a nice stone I found, and so that everyone would know he was there, I painted his name and the date in neat white letters and numbers. Only a couple of nights later, I was hearing just outside the Hogan and something scratching at the door. My grandmother, however, doesn't have any other cat, and I don't remember seeing any hanging around the ranch. Regardless, I go over and open the door, or at least look out, and each time there was nothing. After a couple of nights of this, I decided, come the morning, to go check on my cat's grave. When I got out to the hill, I saw that the stone was still in place, and nothing looked disturbed. But something told me it wasn't right. I went back to the barn for a shovel, and came back and carefully dug up the grave. I removed the box, and before opening it, said a little prayer. When I took off the lid, you can imagine my surprise when his fur and skin were gone, and instead, the box now contained his bones. At least I thought they were his. I just couldn't believe it. I know for a fact that when I buried that box, it was with fur and skin and not a bone in sight. I wish I could say that this incident was the only strangeness that I experienced while living there, but it's not. As a result, my respect for the Navajo Nation, what the elders say, and for skinwalkers has now grown. I'm not saying I was involved with one, but now I really believe and know why our elders don't talk about them. What I will tell you is, don't seek them out. Stop researching about them. Stop thinking about them. You're basically inviting them into your life, because even with small attention that you give them, they will come looking for you. This is a true story. About 2 years ago, my boyfriend at the time and I decided to go on a hike right before the sunset, which, yes, I know, it sounds dumb, but it's something we had done a few times before with no issues. There was something about the woods at night that I liked. Not so much my boyfriend though. In order to begin our hike, we had to go through really tall plants and bushes. We were practically in the middle of nowhere. About a mile into the hike, we came across some abandoned structures and sat down to take a breath. I'm not sure exactly what my boyfriend said, but he told me to do this as a joke, so I whistled and said, "See, there's nothing that's gonna whistle back. We're alone." But not even 20 seconds after saying that, we heard a whistle. It was a bit of ways from us, but still too close for our liking. So we immediately started booking it in the opposite direction of the whistle and didn't look back. We started speed walking. After running for as long as we could, we realized we were lost. We wandered around for about 10 minutes before we stumbled across some train tracks that led back into town about a mile or two down the way. It's also important to note that these tracks had thick woods lining both sides. The right side is where we came from. At this point, we're walking as we had run out of energy and felt safe. We were wrong to assume that we were safe though. We got to the point where we could see the lights from town, maybe a quarter to half a mile away. Down the tracks a little bit, we could see very faintly the outline of what looked to be a deer coming out of the right side of the woods. It stopped in the middle of the tracks and just stood there. I attempted to shine my flashlight on it, but as soon as I lifted my light, it fled. Now, I say fled because ran would not have been an accurate way to describe the way it moved. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like it had 4 broken legs and its body was very low to the ground. Yet, it had unbelievable speed. It almost looked like a bent and twisted monster out of a scary movie. I shined my light into the woods to the left of us as to the direction where it had ran, and when I did, I wish I hadn't. I saw 2 glowing eyes that looked to be at least 10 feet in the air. My boyfriend then said, "What the fuck is that?" in a very concerned tone. I told him, "I don't know. Don't look at it, just run." And we ran and ran until eventually we reached town and walked back home. All of this happened about 2 years ago, and I have tried to come up with a logical explanation after explanation of what I saw that night, and still to this day I can never find a solid, logical answer other than it being something paranormal. I refused to believe what I had seen for a long time, but I know what I saw, and I know I'm not crazy, as there was another person that witnessed the same thing as me. My boyfriend, though, never spoke of it again, and also refused to speak about it when I would talk about it. I never went hiking, or never will go hiking at night after that day. I was spending a month with my cousins at my grandma's house. It was August, and my cousins' ages ranged from 10 to 15, and I was the oldest, being 15. I was staying with a 10, 13, and 14-year-old. We stayed up telling scary stories often, but one night, a few weeks in, we decided to make a campfire out back. My grandma's house is in a suburb area. The neighbors aren't too far when you're driving down the road to the house, but in the backyard, it's a huge thick forest with man-made roads through it. Each house is on a hill, so only part of the basement was actually underground. All of this isn't important though until later on. So we're towards the east side of her yard in a small patch of open land. You couldn't see the neighboring yard from there, and there was maybe 3/4 of a mile on each side of us that belonged to my grandma. It was maybe 11 at night, and we were playing truth or dare after telling scary stories, and my 14-year-old cousin dared me and the 13-year-old to go walk through the roads in the woods for 10 minutes or so. I said yes right away, as I wasn't easily scared, but my younger cousin was a bit more hesitant. We didn't bring a flashlight because it wasn't pitch dark yet, and we could see enough to not die. We were walking through the roads for about 5 minutes and could barely see the fire through the trees when we decided to turn. In the middle of the road was a large dog-like creature, hunched over with its front hands an inch from the ground. What I remember most was how its eyes were so fucking bright white, and it was humanoid dog shape with a human-like head, but a dog-like body with human hands and feet. It then looked at us, and I knew I was paralyzed with fear as it dashed away the opposite way from us, towards the creek that ran through the yard. Eventually, my cousin and I screamed bloody effing murder, and the other cousins and my grandma ran to us. I don't remember much here because I was really confused and I couldn't think right. But I did wake up in bed, so I assumed that I was brought up to the house. All the kids slept in the basement in a big room with a sliding glass door to the outside, as that room was on the side that wasn't underground. My bed was pressed against a big glass window, and I could see my cousins playing outside down below. By the way, the house is in Michigan, so it gets really chilly, even in the end of August, and there was a slight breeze, so I put on a jacket and ran to join them outside, skipping breakfast, not wanting to miss out on any of the fun. When I got down, I could tell they weren't playing, but they were instead running to get my grandma. Her dogs, both of them, were dead, ripped up and torn apart. That night, we ended up going to bed early. I woke up at maybe 2 a.m. because I felt something hit my head. My cousins were all sitting on the double bed opposite of me on the other side of the room. There was one bunk bed and 2 double beds. The double beds for me and my 14-year-old cousin. They were all being quiet and staring at me. The 13-year-old nodded his head towards the window. I froze. They all looked afraid. I turned my head slightly to the side, and I saw a really messed up looking face pressed to the window with gaping eyes looking down at me. I screamed so fucking loud, and this thing at the window bolted and ran away. My grandma called the police after I told her what happened, and they found nothing. I went home after that, and I have never been there during the night again. This didn't happen to me, but to a very close friend of mine. I heard a lot about coyotes and skinwalkers, and had a weird experience or two with coyotes. The creepiest experience was waking up to my sleeping bag being surrounded in paw prints without ever hearing them throughout the night, but never anything paranormal, so to speak. Patrick's story, however, kept me from going back to a favorite backcountry. He was leaving the area one morning, had been camping there a couple of days, and said there was a coyote that always seemed to be close by. He said he always saw it in the corner of his eye. He loaded up his truck and started to drive down the washout to the fire road. At the end of the road, he could see the coyote following him. It was now running next to him. Now he freaked out, so he sped up. He said he was going 35 or so, and it was running along beside him. Definitely not possible. When he looked back, the coyote was now running on 2 legs and was wearing what Patrick said looked like a pair of pants made out of the skin of a buck. Patrick then stepped on it even more, and then not even 3 seconds passed, and he looked back to see if he was being followed, and all he saw was a person wearing a coyote fur, keeping pace with his truck now. When he looked again, it was now gone. We never went back to that area after that again. This incident took place when I was 17. I was with my family. We were going through the mountains near Window Rock, Arizona. It was late at night, and all around us as we drove was darkness and tall trees. We were in a pickup truck. I was sitting in the front with my sister and her husband, who was driving. My 2 brothers and cousin were sitting back in the bed. All of a sudden, this thing or creature runs out in front of us and across the headlights. At the moment, I thought it was a deer. My brother-in-law, Eddie, said it was a coyote. It happened so fast, but just in case, we do say a prayer. After a few minutes, we soon forgot about it, driving along and talking. When up in front of us, there, just standing in the middle of the county road, are 4 more coyotes. Now, I've seen a lot of coyotes out where we live, but rarely do we see them more than 2 at a time, and even less sitting in the road. Eddie slows the truck, but they stay right there almost as if they're daring him. Then, when it looks like he's going to have to stop or hit them, they walk away towards the shoulder and disappear into the trees. Eddie then makes a remark that something spooky is going on, and he wants to get home as soon as possible. But my sister tells him better safe than sorry, and not to go too fast. Now, the only thing worse to us Navajos than coyotes appearing out of nowhere is the hoot of the owl. Well, most of the time it's no big deal, just odd-looking birds hunting for mice. When you hear them the way we did, something's not right. It could mean that someone close to you is in danger. The fact is, if they are hunting, they are most likely quiet. Anyways, we start hearing these owl hoots, one after the other, as if they are calling ahead, alerting some dark entity that we are on our way. More curious than that, there were 6 of us in that truck, and I know I counted 6 hoots. The turnoff from the county road is a dirt road, and it is less than 10 minutes from our house. Eddie is driving along, going a little faster than my sister is comfortable with. Looking back over my shoulder, I can see the rest of them there in the bed, bouncing and sliding around a little bit. Only a minute or 2 down the road, we can see the lights from the houses, still in the distance, but close enough where we're all feeling better about things. But before we get there, Eddie slams on the brakes and yanks the truck to the left. I see something big and black and definitely upright right in front of us. Despite Eddie's efforts, the truck runs right into it. We hit it so hard that it sounded like a gun going off. I was holding on tight to the door and seat, but I could hear the rest of my family being thrown around in the back. They were screaming and cursing. Eddie then managed to get control of the vehicle pretty fast. When it stopped, I jumped out to make sure my 2 brothers and my cousins were okay. They were only banged up a little bit, which is more than I can say for the pickup. The whole nose was totaled. The only thing still intact was one headlight, which was still lit up. As we're standing around the truck, we're all looking to the right of the road, where less than 6 feet away is this 6-foot-high chain link fence that runs along the shoulder in both directions as far as the eye can see. The woods beyond the fence go all the way back into the hills. The point is that there is no way that whatever we hit took off in that direction, or even came at us from that way. Basically, it came out of nowhere, as if it loomed up from the surface of the road itself, or dropped down out of the sky. Meanwhile, Eddie was taking a closer look at the damage. It was, after all, his truck. He noticed that there was some skin, hair, and blood on what remained of the grill, along the lip of the hood, and even by the light fixture that was broken. Convinced that whatever it was hurt and possibly crumpled up nearby. We looked around up and down the road and off to the shoulder to the left, but we found nothing. As it was really dark and things were kind of eerie, we decided we would come back when the sun was up and look around. We all piled back in the truck, but Eddie couldn't get it to start. He would turn the key in the ignition and not even get a sound, as if there was no battery. The funny thing though is that one headlight was still on. Go figure. No sooner had Eddie finished cursing and punching the steering wheel when we hear off in the darkness, and in the trees to the left, some whistling and laughing, as if someone is playing games with us. 1 second it seems to be coming from over here, the next second from over there, and then after that from back a ways. It went on like this for like 10 minutes. My sister tells us that it's a skinwalker, and then she starts whispering Navajo prayers. By this time, only my sister is still in the truck. Eddie and I are standing by the bed on the driver's side, and my other 2 brothers and cousin are in bed. My older brother, Nicky, is unafraid. He thinks that it's just some idiot in the woods, and volunteers to run to the house and come back with my father's car. The house is less than a mile away. No sooner does he start jogging off, we hear the same laughing and whistling go with him, as if he is being followed. He told us later that he was aware of it, and even though he thought he heard his name being whispered, he just kept jogging along all the same. About 10 minutes later, we see these headlights coming towards us. It was Nicky. When we all got back to the house, Eddie called the sheriff to report the accident. It was super late, but he told Eddie he would meet him there and have a look just in case somebody did get hit. I went back with Eddie in my dad's car. The sheriff showed up a few minutes later. He had one of those industrial flashlights, but as much as he looked around, he couldn't find anything either. He agreed by the look of the hair left behind that whatever we hit, it wasn't a deer. When we told him about the whistling and laughing, his whole demeanor sort of changed. It was obvious that he was no longer interested in standing out there in the dark. He went back to his car and wrote out one of those little accident reports and gave it to Eddie. The next day, my mother had a friend of hers come to the Hogan. She was this really old woman that we were afraid of when we were kids. She had this small crystal, sort of pale yellow in color, that she held up and looked through, as if she could see into the past. She told my mother there was a fierce battle of wills between a local medicine man and a skinwalker last night, and that if it wasn't for the medicine man distracting the skinwalker, all 6 of us would have died when the truck went out of control and hit the trees. She never did tell us who that medicine man was or the skinwalker, though she did tell us that she knew them both. And interesting enough, when Eddie went back for the truck the next morning, it started right up without a problem. So if you're ever traveling through a Navajo res or Navajo Nation or around here at night, pray to whatever gods you have that your car does not stop and that you don't run into any dog, coyote, deer, or any animal. This encounter takes place in Chinle, Arizona, at our house. The 5 of us, a school friend, 2 cousins, my sister and I, were all in high school at the time. We were hanging out and everyone decided to spend the night because it was the middle of the summer and it was so hot. We set up our folks' van and my older brother's pickup truck so we could sleep outside where there was at least a bit of a breeze. We spent most of the earlier part of the night doing what teenagers do, including a little smoke, if you know what I mean, and also a couple of beers. Sometime after midnight, the 3 girls decided to call it a night and climbed into the bed of the pickup truck. My friend and I stayed out on the porch for another hour or so before heading to the van. We must have dozed off soon afterwards. According to my sister, she's a year younger than me. She is still awake, just lying there and looking up at the stars. The sky out here is really clear at night. There are stars everywhere. When out of nowhere, the neighbor's dogs from across the dry bed start to bark which around here means that the local wildlife is out and about. My sister says she is listening between the sounds of the dogs to see if she can hear what's out there. Black against black, she suddenly sees this figure crouched on the roof of the pickup and staring down at her. She becomes absolutely frozen, partially out of fear and partially through no will of her own. She wants to scream or at least say something, but she can't find her voice. It's as if she's gasping for air, but without making any noise, and as if her lungs just won't fill. Just then, our younger cousin wakes up. She says because out of nowhere she gets this feeling of intense dread. She sits up kind of suddenly, and at the same time, it is like my sister is released from a spell. The air rushes into her lungs, and she lets out a scream, pointing to the top of the truck. But whatever it was is now gone. All three girls are now wide awake and panicking. They jump out of the back of the pickup and make for the house where my parents are sound asleep. My friend and I, totally oblivious to the excitement and somewhat under the influence, remain blissfully unconscious. Inside the house, my sister tells the other girls what she saw, or at least thinks she saw. At first they're all scared, but then they just start laughing. Then they become brave. My sister grabs a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and the three of them venture out into the dark yard. They come off the porch and paint the front of the property with the beam of the flashlight. They see nothing of interest. Now they head towards the back of the house, all together as if the light is some kind of shield. As the beam moves across the open yard and then to the hill of the back of the property, they see this figure moving quickly and steady, but in an awkward way, as if it has a new pair of shoes, making its way to the top. Before they can get a good look, it disappears over and down to the other side. My sister wants to go after it, but my two cousins pull her back towards the house. They go inside and wake up my parents. My mother refuses to leave the house, but my father, thinking that he's got some sort of thief running around his property, grabs his shotgun, 20 gauge, and makes for the hill. Of course, whoever or whatever it is no longer to be seen. He fires off 2 shots into the darkness anyway. Not that she needs to after those 2 shotgun blasts, but my sister then comes over to the van to wake us up to go inside the house. The only thing I'm asking is why the old man is blasting away into the night. She tells me her story. My friend, who definitely partied harder than I did, doesn't stir an inch. I told my sister I'm staying where I am, so the 3 girls decide they too are staying outside and set up watch. All 3 girls promise they won't fall asleep. Nevertheless, the 2 cousins are soon nodded out, and my sister is again alone with the stars. She says it's no more than 20 minutes, if even that many, when she hears what sounds like someone talking to themselves in Navajo. But it's old Navajo, and she doesn't know what's being said. The sound is coming from back by the hill. My sister wakes up the other 2 girls, and they run back up to the house. My sister makes her way back to my parents' room. My dad is out like a light and not responding. My mother, however, is talking in her sleep, as if she's admonishing someone. At the same time, she is invoking the name of Jesus. We are Christian after all. The next morning, my sister is asking her if she remembers any of it. My mother recalls having a dream in which something dark and menacing is outside the door trying to find its way in. She has no doubt it was evil, but she says that the prayer she did made it go away. Anyways, at the same time my mother is talking in her sleep, my sister feels a presence to the back door of the house of something she describes as evil. All three girls swear there's a heavy smell of something dead, which makes them nauseous. No sooner does my mother name Jesus, the feeling and the smell go away. When morning comes and the sun is up high and bright, the three girls and my mother go outside and have a look around. There, up on the hill, is a spot in the high grass that's all flat, as if something was sitting there. But there are no trails, tracks, or footprints of any kind. As they all come back to the house, my sister leaves the group and goes to the pickup where she left her sandals. She finds upon one of them a clump of long black hair, frizzy and tangled. All of the girls, including my mother, have dark hair, but none of them like that clump. She shows it to my mother, who tells her to immediately throw it into the fire of the stove. She tells her it is the mark of a skinwalker who intends to do bad medicine and must be destroyed. A woman living in White River, Arizona, comes home late at night from running an errand. She pulls up her driveway, gets out of the vehicle, and using her keychain, opens the garage door. Just as it's going up, she hears something run up at her back. As she turns, she sees this dark, shadowy figure slip in behind her husband's truck, which is in the driveway and to her left. The only thing that she sees is that it has patches of short, scraggly hair. And the feet that she saw don't look like they belong to anything that's human. She runs into the garage and into the house, screaming for her husband. He comes out the house and checks all around, but he finds nothing. He does tease her a bit and tells her that she shouldn't let her imagination get the better of her. However, only minutes later, a friend who the husband is expecting arrives. He's all excited and somewhat upset. He explains that as he was coming towards the house, some two-legged creature, he says it looked like a skinny bear, only really scraggly and skinny, with its mouth and teeth exposed, almost like it was drunk. It came stumbling out of the trees and straight into the side of his SUV. He slammed on his brakes, but when he got out to look, there was nothing on the road or off to the shoulder. The two then go out to have a look at the SUV, and sure enough, there's a small dent and some black hair stuck to the rear fender on the driver's side, and some hair in the bumper, but there's no blood. I recently moved to a house in Russia. I spent a few days in there, and I did not feel anything was wrong. One day, I decided to explore the snow-covered terrain, as staying in the cabin had become boring. I then noticed there were scratch marks on my door. They seemed very strong and prominent, yet I thought of it as some effect of the weather. There wasn't anything interesting, only the intriguing environment of the place itself. I soon discovered a pile of bones scattered across the snow. I shook it off as a kill or a hunt of some sort. I kicked at the snow in hopes of finding a decent object that would be the highlight of my day. Along with the last pile of snow I launched, what seemed to be an old phone suddenly appeared and landed right onto the pile of snow. It seemed to be a very early phone. It was also heavily stained with red paint. I felt it would be wrong to switch on the phone, but I was too curious, and it was tough to resist the temptation. After I returned, I charged the phone, and sure enough, it opened up. It seemed to have been recently bought before it was lost or disposed of. All the applications were there, like the ones that you can't delete, but nothing else. I viewed the photo album and I saw a video, one that dated back to December 7th of 2011, but it was all black. The first 2 minutes were continuous crunching, so I assumed the person wasn't intentionally filming that. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like murmuring. I kept repeating that part and made out that the person was whispering some words, and then it was silence. I assumed the video was over. Upon leaving the video, I discovered it wasn't over. There were still at least 3 minutes remaining. It was silent for a minute before I heard a loud roar, and then there was a really loud strike. I could have sworn I heard a bone crack. It was followed by a loud crash. There was silence for a moment before I heard one of the most terrifying ends anyone could meet. I continued to listen as the roars began to fill my ears. Then, out of the blue, a series of blood-curdling screams drowned out the previous sounds. It continued on, and the screams became more desperate, getting loud. I could literally hear sounds of bones crunching. The screams were so loud at this point, and 2 audible cracks were the last thing I heard before the video went silent. I then knew that the scattered bones weren't from an animal in a kill, and that the phone wasn't disposed of, nor was the red paint on the phone actually paint. And most terrifying of all is that whatever the hell caused this, it knows I am here. My friend and I were at a party on the Hopi reservation in Polaca. It was getting late, and we had a pretty good buzz on. Most of the people we knew had already trickled out, so we decided it was a good time as any to leave. We looked around for the friend who was supposed to give us a ride, because we had all come together. We found him in a back bedroom, drunk and passed out. So we had no choice. We're gonna have to walk. The 2 of us lived on the other side of the gulch. A good 2 miles. Between were nothing but trees, scrubs, bushes, and some hills. We had barely cleared the houses onto the road passing between the wooded area when we got this funny feeling we were being watched. We decided to leave the road and cut through the trees. It wasn't the easiest walk, but it would cut the distance down some. And even though it was pitch black outside, we knew the way pretty well. We had been a good 20 minutes off the road and heading up towards the hills when that same feeling of being watched came upon us again. We both turned around at the same time, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything. But then, my friend Paul swore he heard some kind of cackling or mumbling. I didn't hear anything, except for maybe the wind in the top of the trees at our back. By that time, none of us was gonna admit it. We were feeling a little scared. Without saying a single word, we picked up the pace, moving along pretty good but not running. And that's when I heard it too. But now, it was more like heavy breathing. Paul then grabbed my arm and gave me a tug forward. We took off running straight up the hill, which wasn't that big, but it was still enough of a slope so I wasn't feeling it in my legs. And on top of that, I was drunk. Think about this for a second. Running up a hill, at night, drunk, complete darkness, and as you're running, you hear footsteps behind you and heavy breathing. Whatever it was though, stayed with us every step of the way. Right at the top, Paul and I stopped and turned around, expecting the thing to be right on us. But we were standing there, huffing and puffing, and looking at nothing but darkness. A few seconds passed, and then we heard a thin laughter, as if it was coming from down the hill and back from where we started running. We decided to keep moving and put some distance between us. We turned to go down the other side of the hill, and there, standing right in front of us, was this creature. It was standing up on two legs, like a circus dog, only much taller, with both paws extended out in front of it. It had this coyote face, and it was grinning at us, all of its teeth exposed, and its tongue sliding from one side to the other. I couldn't believe how skinny it was, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its rounded stomach sticking out like one of those African kids in the charity ads, and the skin sinking between its ribs. The smell was unbelievably bad, like the smell of an old, wet dog. We both jumped back with a scream, like two little schoolgirls. As we did, the creature dropped down on all fours and ran past us and down the hill back where we had come from. It was yipping and laughing all the way. Paul and I started praying like never before, swearing to Jesus that if he got us home safe, we would never drink again. The laughing, or whatever you want to call it, died down and disappeared. Wasting no time, the two of us made our way down that hill and into the trees that separated us from where we lived. As we walked along, we were trying to convince each other everything was okay. It was only a coyote out searching for a meal. We scared it jumped up at us, and then it ran away. We started feeling better about things overall. We got across the open field and into the trees. We made it all the way through there without anything else happening. However, just as we stepped out towards that first backyard that we needed to cut through to get to the street, we heard this unmistakable chatter, like some little monkey laughing, coming out of the trees just behind us. It was followed by the sound of something moving through the branches and twigs. My friend Paul then yelled out some words that he said that his grandmother had taught him, and just like that, the noise ceased and it got real quiet. He then grabbed my arm again and we ran. We ran as fast as we could through that yard and out to the road. We ran straight for the house where Paul lives with his grandmother. When we got there, we found her awake and sitting in the kitchen with only a small candle for light. She was burning some cedar. When she saw us, she put her finger up to her lips and then pointed to the outside of the house. Her lips were moving, but silently. We stood there still for a minute or two, and then she spoke out loud, saying it was okay. She then said a prayer, and that the Skinwalker was now gone. I have no idea how she knew, and I didn't care. Needless to say, I spent the rest of the night there, sleeping where I knew I would be safe. I live right next to a Navajo reservation and have made friends with many of the people there my age. We like to hang out, play video games, and just be normal teens. I walk over a lot since my best friend lives a little less than a mile away from me. This isn't a long trek, and it only takes about 25 to 30 minutes. I have made this trip dozens of times and have grown very comfortable with it. I know the people along the way, so I'm not scared or on edge. There is a patch of forest, however. About midway there, it's a little unnerving sometimes. There's always that feeling of being watched. This was a regular occurrence for me, so I try to just ignore it and shake it off as my mind playing tricks on me. This day, I spent more time at my friend's house than I meant to, and when I left, it was already getting dark. I reached the stretch of forest right as the sun disappeared from the sky. I shivered a little as I readied myself to begin the journey through. I was 10 steps in when I heard a branch snap. You know the sound, the one that screams, there is definitely someone or something there with you. I froze, not sure what I should do next. Should I run? Should I turn around and book it back to my friend's house? I didn't know the best option in this situation, so I whispered, "Hello?" Hearing my voice crack as the words fell from my lips, I don't know why I even opened my mouth, but it was out there, so I listened for any reply. My heart sank when the answer came back in the sound of my voice. "Hello?" My heart pounded against my chest. I felt like I was gonna faint. "Hello?" My voice came again, but not from my mouth. I wanted to run, but my feet felt cemented to the ground. I couldn't scream. I couldn't reply. "Hello? Hello? 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 Hello?" As my voice echoed over and over from a short distance away. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere around me. "Hello? Hello? 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 Hello?" It repeated. "Stop it!" I finally managed to tear from my lips. Everything went silent. For a long minute, nothing happened. The air grew stale, and I realized for the first time that there was no typical forest sound. There were no bugs, no frogs, or crickets. Nothing. I stood there, terrified, waiting to see what would happen next. "Stop it!" it mimicked back. I had enough and was willing my heavy legs to move. Before I could take a step, I heard some rustling in the bushes 20 feet to my left. I watched as a deer head with huge antlers protruded through the bush as it came further out and stood up on twos. I took off. I flew out of the woods and all the way home in record time. I said nothing to my mom when I got there. I just went up to my room, laid down, and thought about what happened. My mom came in at some point and asked me if everything was alright. I replied yes, I was just tired. I don't know why I didn't tell her. I guess I was afraid of how she would react. I called my friend and told him everything. He freaked out and told me that no matter what happened that night, to not reply or look out my window. But this terrified me even more. He said to call him the next morning and he would explain more, and that he had to speak to his grandfather as soon as possible. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, listening to every little sound the night brought. Around 3 a.m., just as I was about to drift off, the air changed. The night sounds got quiet. I felt my heart begin to pound. I lay there and waited, pulling the covers over my head like a child, far too scared to move. It came after a long moment. "Hello?" I cried. It was all I could do. "Hello? Stop it!" It mocked what I had said in the woods again. It was terrifying enough when it copied what I said. But then, it did something new. It called my name. "Amy." My mother's voice. "Amy! Amy! Come here! Hello? Stop it!" My voice again. For the rest of the night, the creature outside my window called my name in my mother's voice and repeated what I said in the woods over and over. In the morning, when the sun broke through the dark, it finally stopped. I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up around 12 to my friend calling to tell me he had spoken to his grandfather and could explain what happened to me. He said there was a creature that they called yenaglooshi, or he who goes on all fours, or a skinwalker. He explained that it was an evil witch that used dark magic to transform into an animal with the attributes it required, and that this witch had caught my scent and knew me now. I was also given a warning that since it knew me, it would always follow me, and that I would always have to be careful. Last night, I heard scratching on my window. Then, a low hum. The creature began saying my name again, but also adding in things I hadn't said in my mother's voice. At one point, it started calling my name, but drawing it out really far, like Amy. It tried to get me to come outside or to open the door and let it into my house. This went on all night. At this point, I feel like I'm going crazy. I don't know what to do. Is this thing seriously going to stalk the shadows around me for the rest of my life? I don't think I can take that. Many of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word nagual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latin America, we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night, I remember, because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house, in a small pueblo, or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, "Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away, you have nothing to do here. Leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock, he picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a naguat. He told us he spoke to that man and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. When I was younger, my mom would take us on a road trip to her hometown on the Navajo reservation. I would always ask her to tell me a Skinwalker story along the way. I remember every story she's told me was when we were driving through miles of nothing at night. Lucky for us, nothing ever happened to us during those drives. Anyways, this is one of those stories that came from my aunt. So my auntie and some of her friends used to party a lot back in the day. They would hop in an old van, drive out to the boondocks, and just drink and have fun. Of course, this all took place on the Navajo reservation after sunset, but on this specific night, that's what they were doing. Everything was going good and whatnot, when all of a sudden, they hear what sounds like rocks being thrown at their van. Everyone gets quiet as they wonder what the hell is going on. The sounds of rocks being thrown stops, and then something jumps on top of the van roof. I should mention, my family owned a white van that we would use for road trips, cause it had enough room for my brothers and me. So imagine young me being told the story in a van. Terrifying, I know. So everyone starts panicking, and they all hurry to lock all the doors. My auntie jumps in the driver's seat and tries to start the engine. At this moment, of course, the old van then refuses to start, and whatever is on the roof is still up there making banging noises at this point. It sounds like it's jumping up and down. My auntie is freaking out when she sees a hand with long nails reach over the roof and start scratching the windshield. At this point in the story, my mom would take one hand off the steering wheel and scratch the windshield to simulate it. Then whatever was on the roof jumps off. Everyone is still scared, yelling at my auntie to start the van, and she keeps trying. That's when she sees the Skinwalker walk up to the driver's side window and stare at her, just a few inches away. Well, that's when my auntie jumped in the back and started praying for her life. Minutes pass and the Skinwalker appears to leave. Then my auntie hops back in the driver's seat and gets the van to start, and off they go. One summer, when I was only 14 years old, I spent a couple of weeks at my grandparents' house on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. It was close to the New Mexico state line, even though it was out in the middle of the hills. It was an awesome place. My little brother, he was 11. My grandmother was a great cook. She makes the best fried bread. And my grandfather tells great stories, the kind that you can't hear anywhere else. Now, thanks to that visit there, I have a story of my own. My grandparents have this old guy, a Navajo too, who does odd jobs around the house. His name is Paul. He carries around a silver flask. One evening, as soon as the sun is going down, my grandmother then tells me to take him home. My grandfather is the one who always does it, but he is out at a neighbor's ranch, helping with some cattle. I say sure, and it gives me the chance to drive my grandfather's old pickup truck, something that I have never been allowed to do back home. But there on the reservation, no one cares. There's a few people around. It's not like you're gonna hurt anyone. So my little brother jumps in with me, while Paul and my grandparents' dog climb into the bed. Paul lives in a small Hogan, about 10 minutes deeper into the res. By the time we drop him off, the sun is already going down. Back on the road, there's no street lights of any kind. We are driving along when out of the corner of my eye, I notice some movement there in the scrub and low bushes off to the side. I slow down. There are all kinds of sheep around there. The people who own them, letting them roam about the place freely. I don't want to explain to my grandma why there is blood from a sheep in the front grill. As we drive past the spot where I saw the movement, there's nothing there. So I resume speed, bumping along the dirt road without a care in the world. Then out of nowhere, we get a strong whiff of something nasty, as if some animal has died and its body is rotting where it fell. With it comes this sense of deep dread for which I have no explanation. My little brother feels it too, and he doesn't say as much, but I can see it in his face. I then tell him that everything is good, and we keep on driving. Moments later, I look in the rear view mirror and see this dark silhouette of something very tall and very skinny, covered with some kind of hair or fur, running behind the truck after us. Whatever it is, it doesn't look human. My brother sees it too, and he starts crying. My grandparents' dog is in the back, barking. I'm wanting to make the truck go faster, but the dirt road is so uneven, and the pickup is bouncing and shaking all over the place as it is. I'm afraid if I go any faster, I'll crash it off to the road. My brother then starts to scream because it's coming up alongside the truck on my side. I remember being so scared that all I'm thinking is that this thing is going to get us. Then just as I'm ready to cry too, around the bend and coming at us is this car. Just like that, the feeling of dread and panic disappears. Whatever was chasing us is now gone. When we get back to my grandparents' place, we run into the house, checking at our backs to make sure we weren't followed. My grandmother, obviously seeing that we are upset, tells us what's the matter. We can't get the story out fast enough. She tells us it was yenaglooshi, something the Navajo call a skinwalker. She explains that they are people who use black magic and bad medicine. I've been back there many times since then, but this is my only encounter with a skinwalker. So this happened about 12 years ago. My family owns a farm in the heart of an Indian reservation. One winter I was home for Christmas, taking care of the farm. As I was home by myself, late in the night, I hear all of our cows freaking out. I knew it had to be the wild dogs. There are plenty of those in the area. So I throw on some boots, grab a shotgun, load it up, and head out to the field. This was a perfect scenario for a horror movie. It was cloudy, but there was a full moon, and it was breaking through the clouds just right to light up all the snow. I ran out into the middle of the field, and just in time I see two dogs. But they were standing up, facing each other, and fighting. I think, perfect, 2 for 1. So I pump a shell into the chamber of Mr. 12 gauge. And then it happened. The two dogs heard the rack. They both stopped, looked over at me, and ran away on their back legs. I froze, and every ghost story about skinwalkers and all the other native legends I grew up with came to my mind. Also, keep in mind that I am a white guy, and up until then, these were all just boogeyman stories that the native kids like to tell to scare us. But that night, they became real to me. My uncle is Mexican and Native American. This happened in the Mojave Desert in South California. He was driving around with his girlfriend late at night. and they saw something that looked like a huge black dog on the side of the road. He slowed down and the dog then began crossing the road. Instead of walking like a normal dog would, this thing moved like a toy rocking horse. He said it stopped in the middle of the road and stared at them, and its eyes had a red glow. My uncle is the most badass person I know, and it scared the shit out of him. A man from the reservation has just delivered a bull to a buyer's ranch out to the far reaches of the reservation, getting lost in a couple of hours. It is a large expanse of land, and what maps are available aren't always available. Anyways, it's late and getting dark by the time he gets home on the main road towards home. Just as he gets to the intersection where there's no stop sign, he sees up ahead, right in the middle of the road, a lone coyote. It's just standing there. So before he starts driving, he leans on the horn. In response, he watches as the coyote raises up on its back legs. It assumes the form of a man, only his legs and feet. Arms and hands seem more canine than human, and with a spastic gait, it starts walking towards the opposite shoulder. The man, not believing what he's seeing, closes his eyes and shakes his head. When again he looks, there's the coyote sitting off to the side of the road and looking back at him as if it's waiting on him to drive by. The man, certain that it's the lights playing tricks on him and the fact that it has been a long and draining drive. However, as he passes the coyote, he gives it a quick look and he sees that this coyote is grinning back at him. Having heard stories of skinwalkers, the man blesses himself and he fixes his eyes on the road ahead. I am Navajo. We had an incident with an unwelcome visitor in our home. Here's what happened. My cousin is sleeping over. He's the same age as me. We're both 13 at this time. We're in my room, talking and hanging out. It is around maybe 11 p.m. It is a pleasant summer evening, so my window is wide open. It's also pretty dark outside, and my dad is in the living room watching TV. But as always, he's dozed off on the couch. My mom has already gone to bed. My cousin and I are keeping it down, but we're not ready yet to call it a night. All of a sudden, we hear the screen door to the front of the house open and slam shut. We think it's my dad. My mom, she tells us the next day she hears footsteps on the carpet. Whoever it is, she says, goes through her room and towards the bathroom, so she naturally assumes it's my dad. Then she realizes that she's unable to move, as if she's paralyzed. Still, in my room, my cousin and I again hear the screen door open and slam, only this time more loud. It wakes up my dad, and he comes to my bedroom to check on us. Finding us both there, he wants to know which one of my friends just slipped out of the house. It takes a few minutes, but we convince him we were by ourselves and that we thought it was him going in and out. I can see by the look on his face, he's not really buying it, but he has to admit we don't seem to be lying. He then leaves, and as he's closing the door to my room, he tells us to stay out of trouble and go to sleep. All we could do is shrug. The next morning, my mom tells us about what she heard and how she could not move. She also tells us that the second time the door slams, she then hears what sounds like a horse galloping by her bedroom window. She then has all of us pray, and now, every year, we hike up the mountain to a high point and we pray for protection from evil. This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limp, and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face and his shirt, to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair, a canine snout only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body. I was only 17 at the time. On this specific night, I woke up feeling thirsty. I'm just lying there, staring into the dark, and deciding if it's worth the effort to get up and get something to drink. I'm sure we all been in that situation plenty of times before. So tonight, when you're in bed and you're questioning if you should get up and get some water, remember this story. So all I can hear is the clock ticking down the hallway and the muted silence. It's just way too quiet. I check the time on my cell phone. It's a few minutes short of 2:30 a.m. I then decide to sit up and get out the bed. I then make my way towards the door of my bedroom. It's really dark. I go down the hallway towards the kitchen. As I get out to the living room, I chance to look to my right and in the direction of the front door to the house. The only light is coming from a street light that is down at the end of the property and not all that far away. There, at the inside of the door, inside the house, I see this figure standing there. Its face at first appears human, then serpent-like, and then back to human, as if it can't decide how it wants to present itself to me. For some reason, I'm just standing there taking this all in. I'm not afraid, but I don't feel like I have any control over my senses either. And I'm not sure if I could move or have said anything, even if I wanted to. which at the time, I can't say I did. As the two of us are standing face to face, he assumes his human features. His face is fully painted, a thick stripe of black across his eyes, and the rest white. He has a feather woven into the hair at the top of his head. He looks young, not much older than me. He is bare-chested, not real muscular, but definitely cut. His torso is painted red. His lower half is covered in what looks to be khaki-colored pants, well worn and faded, cut off and frayed just below the knees. He is barefooted, but his wrists and ankles are wrapped with animal skin of some sort. It is hairy and light, colored like that of a coyote. He doesn't say anything to me, not aloud anyway, but I do hear his words in my head, although for the life of me, I can't remember any of it. It's as if he at the same time, with this cold stare of his, is pinching away layers of my memory. I do remember wondering why he is in my house, and having the idea that he was expecting to find someone else. Just then, without even thinking about it, my cell phone in my hand, I begin dialing 911. With the phone ringing, I look back to the painted stranger. He gives me a thin smile and vanishes through the door, which by the way is closed and locked. To the other side, I hear what sounds like a horse galloping away. I move over to the door and pull it open. I see this figure taking long strides across my yard, away from the light and out into the street. There's a car parked on the other side. He goes around to the passenger side, ducks down and into the car, and it drives off. It all happens in a matter of seconds. I then realize there's a police operator talking back to me from the phone. I tell her there was someone in my house, but I leave out the part about his changing appearance and leaving through a closed door. The operator, or whoever she was, tells me not to worry about it. She says that I'm not the first caller of this kind on this night. She tells me to say a prayer, telling me that she too is Navajo and to go back to bed and that I won't be bothered by it anymore. My older sister, who is Irish, Italian, recently got married. Not her first, to this guy who is Navajo. Shortly after they settled down together, she has a boy from her first marriage. They invite me to hang out with them down on the reservation, where her new husband has a house and some property. I ended up bringing a few friends. Being a white guy, I know nothing about native or Skinwalker lore. One of the friends that comes along, Gregory, however, is into horror and demons, things like that, and knows all these different werewolf, vampire, and even Skinwalker stories. That first night, with not much else to do, we are out in the middle of a few 100,000 acres of hills and wooded land. We end up sitting around a small bonfire, with him telling us one story after the next. The next day, we all take a walk to the elementary school to bring my nephew home. My sister usually picks him up, but she has some errands to run. Along the way, we pass this scraggly looking dude sitting beneath this tree beside the road. He looks kind of old, but in a way that is difficult to say just how old. Regardless, it's definitely creepy the way he's watching us. His eyes kind of flat and dull, as if unaffected by the sunlight. As we make our way back from the school, my nephew seems pretty quiet and shy. When he sees this guy, he ducks behind me and starts tugging on my shirt. I ask him what's up, and without taking his eyes off the guy, he whispers, "I don't like that man. He's bad, The way he said it gives me chills, but I really don't think all that much more about it. Well, that night, Gregory and my other two friends, Jeff and Sarah, and I all head out to go check out this abandoned part of the reservation, which supposedly is haunted. We had been warned not to by my brother-in-law. He says it is an inhabited place of ghosts of the past and some kind of dark being. Of course, that only serves to make us want to go even more. So we dismiss his warnings and ghost stories, take the keys to my sister's SUV, and off we go. When we first get there, I have to admit, it is a lot spookier looking and feeling than any one of us had expected, consisting of only a handful of abandoned structures, most of the faded and graying wood, and the biggest of which is only 2 stories. It looks to me to have been some sort of mining town, like the kind that you see on westerns on TV. Anyways, just about every window is completely busted out, with only a shared appointed pane hanging here and there. There isn't a single door still in place, and definitely not an item of any value anywhere to be seen. In fact, there isn't much of anything at all. As we walk around, going up to and looking into some of the places, but not entering, Jeff takes us to telling us how this reminds him of one of his past flings with some girl. Sarah and I rolled our eyes, as we always do when he starts waxing old memories and then goes off a little ways, leaving him and Gregory together. We find a cozy corner out of sight and start getting comfortable, if you know what I mean. We are going at it for all 5 seconds when we both notice it has suddenly turned chill. Just as we huddle together for warmness, we hear a blood-curdling scream. We jump up and run back into the direction of the SUV and where we last saw Gregory and Jeff. There, they are facing the remains of the storefront, their eyes staring straight ahead and oblivious to the fact that we are there. Sarah and I both look to where they are staring, and we see this creature, that it is a wolf-like creature, but yet not being a wolf completely. I'm still not sure to this day if it was real or not. Either way, I for one am scared, as I have never been in my life. Its body is fully covered in hair, and it had these long wraith-like fingers, which end in thick curled nails, definitely claw-like. Its head is the worst though. Its eyes are just these 2 chunks of dark coal, flat and emotionless. Its mouth is full of small daggers. I'm not sure how long we stand there frozen. Finally, it takes a step forward, and as if released from some spell, we bolt to the truck. Jeff and I jump into the front seat, he to the driver's side, and me in the passenger, while Gregory and Sarah go for the back. Jeff doesn't have his license, but at that point no one's arguing. The keys are in the ignition. He starts the SUV, floors the gas, and we speed off gravel and sand flying everywhere. I look out the window on my side, and then all around. I see nothing through the cloud of dust and the darkening twilight. When I turn to look back at Gregory, the only thing he could think to say is, "You got some lipstick on your chin." Just down the road some, Jeff slows the truck. By this time we are all laughing and making fun of each other for running away from shadows. Just then, a look of fright comes over Sarah's face, and without saying a word, she points a trembling finger out towards the trees along the side of the road. There, back in the dark of the trees, is where we see the shadow-like figure running just inside the tree line, as if it's keeping pace with us, and we all yell in unison to Jeff, and he again presses down on the gas. The SUV springs into life, but that thing, whatever it is, stays with us every inch of the way. It is only when we see the lights to my sister's porch that making the turn off to her. When we pull up to the house, My brother-in-law is out on the porch with this guy dressed in a long sleeve button white shirt, blue jeans, and work boots. He later introduces himself as the local shaman. When we get up to the porch, the guy is in the middle of some kind of blessing. When he finishes, my brother-in-law simply turns to us and says, "Now you know, maybe next time you'll listen." Later, after the shaman leaves, he admonishes us, saying that by telling the Skinwalker stories, we put everyone out there in danger. He said just mentioning them can make them come and seek you out. Okay, so I've been a skeptic of creepy paranormal things my entire life. I have never believed in that type of stuff, but the things I have heard, witnessed at my grandparents' farm shakes me to my core. My grandparents own a large plot of land in central Missouri, and they have owned that land for around 40 years. I've been to that farm over 10 times, and every time I go, I always get this terrifying feeling that something is watching me. Like, there's always something behind my back. I have also had many strange encounters there that are downright bizarre. My first encounter with whatever the hell this thing was when I was around the age of 7 or 9. I'm currently 14. We had brought our dog named Spot to that farm. He was a silver lab who I loved dearly. I was exploring the forest behind the house, just enjoying the summer breeze, when my dog started growling. A deep, sinister growl that I had never heard him make. I turned around quickly to see what he was growling at, but I couldn't see anything but forest among more forest. While my eyes were scanning the area of where my dog was growling, some animal shot out of the brush so fast I could barely see what it was, and before I knew it, it was gone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, absolutely flabbergasted by what I just witnessed. From what I could see of it, it looked like a coyote, but the speed at which it moved was absolutely insane. It moved like at 90 miles an hour and made almost no noise. But the most creepy part was that the place it jumped out of didn't even make an imprint of where it was laying. And from where I viewed it jumping up, I should have been able to easily see where it was hiding. Shocked by what I witnessed, I just decided that was enough and went back inside the house. My second encounter happened when I was around 10. I was visiting the place, and like usual, I was getting the feeling I was being watched. That first day was normal, and nothing really creepy happened. I was just spending quality time with family. But when night came, that's when shit started happening. I was trying to sleep in the twin bed that was shared by my mom's brother when he used to live there. That's when I heard tapping. Not tiny little taps, but loud tap. Almost like it was banging. It was coming from the direction of the window. I slowly sat up and looked at the window, but there was nothing. So I assumed it was just some animal or something like that. 5 minutes passed and no tapping, and I was drifting off to sleep when, this time, not a tap, a slam, a loud slam directly into the window. I'm not talking about like a hit. It sounded as if something absolutely massive hit the window. I shot up so quickly, I nearly passed out. I decided enough was enough and grabbed the flashlight in the drawer and shined it out the window. Nothing. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. I was about to go crawl into my mom's bed when I heard it. A screech. A screech that was not achievable by any human. So loud, it pierced the quiet, peaceful summer night. I can't put into words what that sound sounded like, but it was dark and horrible, and I still remember it to this day. I froze, unable to move muscle. I was so scared. I was sitting there still as a statue, petrified by what I heard. That's when my instincts kicked in, and they told me to run into my mom's room, which I did. For some reason, I didn't wake her up. I just cuddled up next to her and didn't sleep the entire night. All I could think of was that sound, that horrific, terrible, bloody screech. My next encounter was when I was around the age of 13. I was back at my grandparents', just enjoying my time, like I always do when my grandpa suggested that we go deer watching. I agreed because I had been doing this since as long as I could remember. And it was never an issue, and it was extremely fun. So we took the Polaris, and we went around 6 to 7 p.m. to look for deer. We decided to go into the most eastern pasture, because that's usually where we spotted the most deer. 30 minutes passed, and we had seen a few deer, but not as much as we usually do. But then, this is where the shit begins. I get that feeling again, that dreadful feeling that something is there, and the shadows watching me. But this time, it's a lot more intense. Like if it's right up behind me, but when I look, it's never there. But this time, it appears that my grandpa feels the same presence as me too. And just to let you all know, my grandpa is a very laid-back individual, always joking and having a laugh. The only time I've seen him be very serious is when my great-uncle died a couple of years ago. So when I started feeling that I'm being watched, my grandpa goes from a happy and laid-back expression to very serious and alert. He gripped the wheel so tight, his knuckles turned white, and he was just looking around like to make sure something wasn't following us. He then made a massive U-turn out of nowhere and started heading back to the house. I asked him, "What are you doing?" And he replied with, "We're heading back to the house." The tone of his voice was cold, like he had witnessed someone being murdered. At this point, he was gripping the wheel even harder and was absolutely going pedal to the metal full speed back to the house. I decided not to ask any questions until we got back to the house, which we did in no time at all. Once we were there, he rushed me into the house, checking his back to make sure something wasn't there. When we were inside, he closed and locked the door tight. His behavior was very alarming, and it really shocked me to my core. I then decided that all of the stuff I had witnessed was enough, and I only asked him one question: "What the hell is going on here?" When I said that, he looked at me and gave me a cold expression and said, "I have some things I need to explain to you." We then sat down for 30 minutes, and he explained that whatever this thing was, it was living on his property, and it has been here since the day he moved in, and he and my mother experienced the same thing that was happening to me the very first few years of living here. He explained that he has seen whatever this thing is, and it doesn't like new visitors. He told me about all the things he had witnessed and experienced, and they seem to have been very pretty similar to what was happening to me. He told me that he knew this was going to happen to me and that he was always watching to make sure I never got hurt because he knew this creature better than anyone else. We talked some more, but all of it was the same. It was now late and he decided that I couldn't sleep alone, so he had me sleep with my mom. We promptly left the next morning. I have not been back since that day. This last encounter isn't really an encounter. Two things have happened at my grandparents' farm. Recently, we brought my sister's horse to the farm. The first night for the horse was hell. My sister's horse has always been very friendly and not shy. But the first night of my sister's horse being at the farm was bizarre. The next morning, my grandpa woke up and was doing his usual chores and went to go feed the horse. He noticed that the horse was acting very weird, extremely shy and timid. But when he took a better look, he was shocked. The horse had 3 10-inch gashes down its side, like something had clawed at it. It was ruled out that the horse ran into the fence, but I think otherwise. Also, around the same time, my grandparents adopted a dog and named it Panda. Panda was a Jack Russell Terrier who was 2 months of age. 5 days later, he was found dead with deep puncture wounds on his body and with his neck slashed up. They said it was a bobcat or mountain lion, but I also think otherwise. This story comes from a 28-year-old young man who calls himself Leo. When he was a boy, his grandmother, a Navajo woman, would tell him stories about dark spirits and skinwalkers. He recalls he used to wave her off, telling her there was no such things. In fact, whenever he would go out at night, he would make sure to tell her and make fun of her that he'll be walking alone. However, his arrogance came back to get him shortly after his 17th birthday. On the evening in question, he is out cruising about with 2 of his cousins, just drinking a few beers, listening to music, and doing a whole bunch of laughing. From St. Michael's, Arizona, their purposeless selves takes them through Sawmill and then along the back roads in and around Chinle, where they eventually get lost for a while, driving deep in the woods and looking for anything they might recognize as a way back to the road. Leo is sitting in the back seat on the passenger side and looking out the window. He recalls it is definitely after 10 p.m. There, deep in the trees, he sees a single fire. The flames contain to a small space and close to the ground. He is just about to say something to the others when they too react. Looking now in the direction they are pointing, he sees many more of these small fires, literally dozens of them, popping up there within the trees, burning brightly for a moment or two, and then going out, only to have others ignite but a few feet or yards away. This goes on all the while they are driving along through this one stretch and seems to be keeping pace with them. Leo first has the thought that it is maybe a controlled fire process, something the local rangers and fire department do to control the undergrowth to reduce the potential for out-of-control forest fires. But being that it is nighttime, he quickly discards the idea. Besides, he notices and mentions to his 2 cousins that the fire so close to the base of the trees should be setting them on fire as well. Yet not one of them goes up or, from where he's looking, even gets scorched. They're both spooked and intrigued. They pull the car alongside the road and get out, beers in hand. However, they stay by the car with no desire to actually go into the woods. One of the cousins starts calling out to see if anyone will answer. The other cousin is less eager, telling everyone to be quiet and listen. But there's nothing to listen to. The fires, which continue to flare up and die down, aren't making any noise. For example, there's no crackling of anything burning, not even small twigs. Then within seconds, they find themselves standing in the dark. Every fire has now gone out, and there's not even new ones. Not believing their own eyes, they walk into the trees towards where they had agreed that one of the near fires had been. But no matter how much they look around, they can't find any sign of fire. No smoke, no charred ground, and no ashes. Nothing. There isn't even the smell of burned leaves or wood they expect to linger. But what's even more strange is that when they do go back to the car, they can't help but notice the smell of smoke on their clothes. The next morning comes, and Leo tells his grandmother and mother what he had seen. While his mother shows very little interest, there is a knowing gleam in the eyes of his grandmother, but she has nothing to say. Almost immediately after that night, Leo says everything that could possibly go wrong does. First, each one of his cousins that were with them are involved in unexplainable accidents and are hurt seriously enough. One of them receives a second-degree burn when the gas tank of a motorcycle he is working on ignites without reason or warning. The second one suffers a broken collarbone when the branch of a tree in his yard snaps and comes down across his shoulder. He too has no warning, even though he acknowledges that it is the same tree that was hit by lightning a month or so earlier. Strange enough, both accidents happen on the same day and almost at the same time. As for Leo, even though it's much less painful, all of the family vehicles break down within days of each other. It is at this point that the family makes the choice to seek the help of the local medicine man. Together, they climb into his aunt's car. She's the mother of the cousin with the broken collarbone, which had worked fine earlier that day, but now it refuses to start. Leo suggests that it's the battery, so they attempt to jumpstart it with his grandfather's truck. It is not in the best shape. It's driven only locally, and it's not even registered or insured, but it always starts. But this time, it won't turn over. Finally, they find a neighbor who is nice enough to take them. When they get to the medicine man and tell him everything, starting with the fires, he says to them, "You already know who is doing this to you." Leo recalls they all just look at one another, each without a clue. His grandmother, however, tells them that she'll explain it on the ride back home. She sends them out to the car to wait while she speaks with the medicine man. When she comes back, she tells them that it's gonna be okay. On the way back, Leo's grandmother tells them about her great-grandfather. She says that the family had a 30-acre plot, which they had been living on for generations. When he passed away, and before his own children could lay claim to the property, a man and his wife built themselves a crude Hogan on the far side of the property and moved in. When her great-grandfather's sons, one of whom was her grandfather, tried to evict the man from the property, he used dark medicine to chase them off. He even kept their own father from building a house on the far side of the property along the arroyo. She then tells Leo that the woods in which he and his cousins saw the fire is the outer edge of that property, and the smoke they smelled on themselves was the mark of the Skinwalker. She says the old squatter and his wife are both more than 100 years old, and even though no one has seen them for years, she's still sure that they live there still. All Leo knows is that since the visit with the medicine man, he and his family have had no further experiences with the Skinwalker. He says that there are nights when the dogs bark, and it seems they try to break free from their chains, like there's something out in the darkness, which they want no part of. On those nights, Leo is sure to say his prayers, both in Navajo and the ones he learned in the Catholic Church. He's convinced the words will protect him from the old man and his wife, two powerful skinwalkers that he doesn't want playing around in his head. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush, trying to make his way to the tree stand he had built earlier in the summer. He was for sure that this location would give him a good sight to the neighboring field, in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he told himself, as he recalled the events of the day so far. He had awakened at 4:30 a.m. He began to get ready for the long day in the woods on the backside of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflage hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He was gonna need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold November morning. How could it be this cold, this early in the year? He wondered as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to make a breakfast that would stick to his ribs long into the day. But he finally settled on toast, country ham, and scrambled eggs. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that had left a bitter aftertaste in his mouth. In fact, he could still taste it. After this, he packed himself a cheese sandwich for lunch. He grabbed his Remington hunting rifle, some coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and turned right into the one-lane blacktop road that led to the backside of his property. After about 2.25 miles, he turned right again. He had to travel about half a mile down that pitiful rut-filled excuse for a road when he came to his desired location. He then got out of his truck and loaded his gun and walked off into the woods. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy, overcast day and the wind that was blowing through the trees, making all the leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought, it's gonna be a good day anyway, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as though someone had stepped over his grave. He got the distinct feeling that he was being watched, but by whom? This was, after all, his property, and it was posted. No one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone, but if he was alone, why couldn't he shake this eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a silence in the forest. No birds, no insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that it was nothing more than a case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing not too far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer, but he wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from this distance because the sun wasn't completely up yet and the forest was still covered in shadows. Jacob then walked closer to get a better look and found that he had been correct. It was a deer, a large 8-point buck in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him, and icy fingers dance along his spine. Something about this kill just didn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out, and the stomach was ripped open. Plus, also several of the internal organs were missing. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this? He wondered. A fear like nothing he had ever experienced before began to wash over him in waves. What is going on? He thought. At nearly 225 pounds and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give into fear, but now he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. That feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled body and head back to his truck and back to safety. No more than 6 steps into his journey, his blood turned to ice in his veins as a deep, guttural scream shattered the eerie silence and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on the farm all of his life and had been an experienced hunter since he was a child. He was familiar with every animal in the part of the state. Fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his Remington rifle and turned around only to find there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion, and he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I gonna die? His survival sense kicking into overdrive. Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was to get to the truck and get out of there. Slowly and cautiously, he made his way toward the perceived salvation of his vehicle, silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him from his only avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy footfalls off to his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks, and debris that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look in the direction of the noise. And that is when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and get to a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden, or anyone that would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered more than 7 feet and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think that he was about to become a national statistic, a person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume that they have become lost, injured, or been the victims of animal attacks, with their bodies never recovered. Please God, don't let that happen to me, he told himself as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, and 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. And like a miracle, he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, he pulled himself up into the cab and started the engine and hit the gas. But the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a puddle of mud, and now the tires simply spun in place. Not now, he thought. I can't be stuck. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered, this truck is a 4-wheel drive. There is no way I can be stuck, and was ready to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares are not so easily left behind, and there is nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake up from. And Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he turned and immediately wished that he had not. It took him maybe half a second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever see normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband and a dad and a guy that liked to go hunting and watch football on the weekends. That reality had evaporated away, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed and things really do go bump in the night. And now, an ambassador from that nightmare realm was standing just outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that his world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie. In his most terrifying, fevered dream, he couldn't have imagined that such a thing could exist. It was hideously ugly, easily standing 8 feet tall, with a thick, muscular body. There was just something about that face that was just wrong, almost like a mixture of a man and an animal experiment that had gone horribly wrong. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was completely covered with thick, shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with God only knows what, and it walked on 2 legs, not on 4 legs, like you would expect from some kind of animal. What was this thing that had shattered his perception of reality? Was it a demon? Was it a werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. But whatever it was staring at him, and it didn't look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate him to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jacob threw his truck into gear and took off as though he was being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, with his mind racing, wondered what he was gonna do. How will I ever feel safe on this farm again, he thought. Are my wife and children in danger? What and where did this thing come from? And will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swirled through Jacob's mind came to an immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the blacktop and guarantee safety. How is this even possible, he thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago, and this path was clear. It was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get that tree moved if he was going to make it back home, since he didn't have a chain to pull the tree out of the road, nor did he have a saw with which he could cut up the unexpected barricade. He was left with a few options, one of which was walking, which he discounted immediately. The most logical course of action that he could come up with was to call for help. His best friend Kenny Patterson owned the farm just over from his. If he were home, he could bring a saw and cut the tree up for him. Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times, and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he told the recent events to Kenny and said, "Please, hurry. I'm not kidding. There is something out here." Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hanged up the phone and braced himself for what he was sure would be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting motionless inside of his truck, every sound made his imagination run wild with fear. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. The clock seemed to be an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions, for any sign to see if this nightmarish monstrosity had pursued them. In every shadow that the forest and on this cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that had followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose himself long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his path. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments, he was able to see the old red Chevy as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend, and a sense of relief washed over him as he realized that he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I told you to hurry." Kenny, with a surprised look on his face, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe that only 11 minutes had passed. It had seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not broken. It had not been cut. It had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large bipedal footprints that had a somewhat human appearance to them. But if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then without a word, went to work on the tree. Kenny took a chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut up the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw, and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before they could even open their doors, an ear-splitting scream erupted from the woods behind them. Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looks like some kind of monster. And I think we need to get out of here, now." Kenny looked as though the blood had drained completely out of his face, became very pale as he said to Jacob, "Jacob, man, I never mentioned this to anyone before now, but over the last few months, that thing has been killing off a few of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out, and the bodies are mangled and broken. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over here when you called. I actually heard that sound a few times off in the distance at night, but never this close. So I think you are right, old buddy. It's time to go." Cautiously and with a sense of urgency, Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and made their way back into the blacktop. Both vehicles then began the 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house so they could decide what course of action should be taken. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to gently fall. He then reached over and turned his wipers on as snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbor, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing in the field that bordered his own property. Having put a distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm down. Not willing to let this opportunity pass him by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder of the road and signaled Kenny to do the same. Kenny knew what Jacob was thinking as he pulled in behind him and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said, "What are you doing, man? We need to get out of here now." Jacob said, "I know, and we will. In just a minute, man. I just can't turn this down. I have to take the shot. That's a 6-point buck standing there. It's not the trophy that I wanted, but at least I won't end up going home empty-handed. And after what happened this morning, I think I deserve a little something good. Alright, just take the shot so we can go. I still don't feel right about this," Kenny said. Jacob steadied his rifle across the hood of his truck. He zeroed in on the buck and was getting ready to fire. That's when he heard Kenny make a gasping noise, and whisper, "Oh my God, what is it, man? What's wrong with you? Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope, Jacob immediately saw what had been the cause of Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside a tree line in the edge of the field was the creature that they had left behind. Not even 5 minutes. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through his scope for a full 30 seconds before it even moved, and when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to walk towards William's barn that was just about 500 yards from where the woodland demon had been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, "Kenny, call William and tell him that there is something trying to get into his barn. I know he has livestock in there, and if that thing gets in it, it will kill all of them." Attempting to get rid of this monster, werewolf, Wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot but missed. The creature turned towards them and glared at them through red, hate-filled eyes, and then began to run towards them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed right behind him. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house as though they were driving on the NASCAR circuit. Arriving at home, Jacob, gun in hand, ran inside to get a phone book so that they could call the game warden and the police and get some kind of animal control out there to get rid of this thing. Jacob had just stepped out of his front porch when they heard gunfire coming from over at William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed his 12-gauge shotgun and some shells and handed them to Kenny, who took little time in loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked together to their truck and got ready to mount up a rescue for their neighbor William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as a familiar but uneasy feeling crept over them, and Jacob's 2 German shepherds began to whimper and ran under the front porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had gone dry as a bone, whispered to Jacob and said, "I have a really bad feeling about this." No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a scream erupt from the forest off to their right, and the creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast, but standing less than 30 feet away from them, they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height at maybe 8 feet. But now, standing there, looking up, he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 or 9 feet tall, and would tip the scale at 800 to 1,000 pounds. It had inhuman long arms that were easily seen beneath its long shabby black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there was little doubt that it could have pulled the arms off an ape, and now it stood there, staring at them. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore into its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched speechless as it crawled into the tree line, struggled to its feet, and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene, the local warden, showed up to take their statements and told them that he had been called out to answer numerous such reports in the area, but he wasn't sure what to make of all these reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There is no animal in this area, or any area for that matter that fits your description. I'm not saying I don't believe you, I just don't know what it is." Jacob, whose face was reddened with anger, said, "Come here. Here's the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face, and he asked if they would care to go with him as he tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said they weren't going without a gun. Gene stated that he planned to take his gun as well. All 3 men loaded their guns and set out following the tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen on the leaves. They followed the trail for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding that the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them gave up the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since there was now apparently more than one creature. And the cloudy, overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it would normally be this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Gene informed them that there was nothing left that he could do but file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbors to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them and said they had most likely just seen a bear or something. No one believed them except William, who had also seen it himself the same day they had. He had even taken a shot at it, but missed. Jacob, William, and Kenny knew what they had seen, and they knew it was still out there, and they didn't care who believed them and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbors began to take the story a little more seriously, as family pets began to disappear, and other pets were found mangled. Other farms in the area began to find their cows and other livestock torn open, with their throats ripped out. Just a week after shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own German Shepherd was found dead with its throat torn out, and it was hanging across a limb in a tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new animals died the same way. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up. But Jacob and Kenny know that there is still something out there in the forest. They still occasionally find tracks, or a slaughtered cow or goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off into the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there, watching and waiting, biding its time. Something cold and cunning and cruel. Something not human, with a taste for blood and revenge. Yenaglooshi is a forest in far north Norway. I recently moved to Laxalev for work. Even though it was January, I figured that since I was out in the wilderness, that I might as well go out into the woods to explore a bit. There wasn't a whole lot to do in town. Besides, I heard the trails in this part of the country were pretty nice. There was only a few blocks between my house and the edge of the woods. Anyways, I grabbed a bottle of water and a little bag with trail mix. I was going on a trail after all, and off I went. It had snowed the day before. I guess snow is pretty common up here. It was a pretty soft snow, the kind that ski resorts prefer. It would crunch loud as I stepped on it. Despite the trail being covered up by the snow, I was pretty confident in my ability to keep track of the trail, since the forest was somewhat dense, and the opening where the trees were removed was distinguishable, and so I wasn't worried about getting lost. It was still pretty early in the afternoon, only about 1 p.m. I wasn't worried about the sun going down. Then again, I had only moved from Virginia fairly recently, so Norway might as well have been a different planet in terms of climate and daylight. At least, that's what I thought. It might have just been a big change that I was seeing as being bigger than it was. After about half an hour, I wasn't terribly deep in the woods. I was moving at a pretty slow pace after all. I had passed a lot of scenery, but nothing that really stood out. Just a lot of trees, a few which had fallen. It was at this point that I realized something that surprised me just a little bit. I wasn't alone in the woods. I stopped briefly when I noticed that a few flakes were weakly drifting to the ground, and noticed that I could hear something else. I could hear the sound of snow crunching under a human's foot. They didn't sound like they were wearing heavy boots or anything. It was much more quiet. I could only really tell it was a person because it was clearly 2 feet. They sounded distant, just barely close enough for me to actually hear it. The woods were pretty quiet. It wasn't windy or anything like that. That's when I saw her in the distance. A woman. Even though my memory is shaky, I say that she was about the ballpark of about 50 yards away. I could just barely see her moving between the trees, drifting almost casually through the snow. But something struck me about her appearance though, so I knew I had to get closer to her to know if I was right or not. So I pursued her. I didn't want to call out to her yet, but I did begin trying to hurry up. She didn't seem like she was moving very fast, but I was struggling to keep sight of her in the forest. Finally, I was about 10 yards away from her, and now I was close enough to confirm what I thought I had seen before. The woman was completely naked. I figured this woman must need help, that she must have been on something, or she was mentally ill. Nobody walks around in the snowy woods with no clothes on, with nothing on. "Excuse me," I piped up, but she didn't acknowledge me. She must have been on some serious drugs. "Excuse me," I repeated, a bit more loud this time. She kept walking, even though when I said that, her pace had slowed just a little bit. I didn't mean to stare, considering the situation, but she really was gorgeous from what I saw of her. Without going into any details, I'll just say her body and what little of her face I managed to see was damn near perfect. I shook off the distraction and began trying to approach her. I got to about 5 yards from her when she suddenly stopped. It was such a sudden thing that I stopped too. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you okay?" I asked in the best Norwegian I could, even though I knew it wasn't very good. She stood motionless in the forest for a few seconds before quickly turning to me. I then got a good look at her face. She didn't seem bothered by the cold. Her flowing blonde hair looked to have just come from a salon. Her body didn't seem to be reacting to the cold at all. No frostbite, no bluish tint, no shivering, not even one single goosebump. What really struck me about her was her eyes. Her eyes were an icy, cold-looking blue, almost gray. She had no expression, and despite having turned to me, she didn't seem to really notice that I was there. Her face and body language didn't indicate that she was actually acknowledging me. She never looked directly at me. I figured that she must really be on some serious drugs. I stopped for a second or two to think of what she might be on, before remembering her current situation. Ma'am, are you alright?" I repeated. No response. "I can call a hospital for you if you need me to," I offered. At that point, I realized that I didn't bring my cell phone with me. Shit, what would I do now? I had no way of contacting authorities with this drugged up naked lady in the middle of the frozen woods, but I didn't feel comfortable just leaving her out here to go and get help. What if a search team wouldn't be able to find her in time? How long has she been out here anyways? I figured that my best option would be trying to get her to follow me back to town. "Ma'am, would you like my coat?" I offered. It was better than just letting her freeze, after all. She didn't react to my question at all, despite the cold. I took my coat off and began to approach her. That's when I noticed something I didn't notice before. Her fingers and toes now seemed to be a blue color. She didn't seem at all frostbitten not a moment ago. Where did that come from so fast? I knew I had to get her out of here, and fast. As I got closer, There was more frostbite I hadn't noticed before on her nose and ears. Suddenly, she turned away from me and began walking away. "Hey, wait!" I called out to her. No response. Suddenly, her pace quickened. A few seconds later, she was running. And a few seconds after that, she was out of sight. "Damn it," I shouted. I would have to try to follow her footprints in the snow now. But that's when I noticed that she wasn't leaving any footprints. What the hell was going on here? A naked lady walking aimlessly in the middle of a Norwegian winter with randomly appearing frostbite, and she wasn't leaving any footprints? Was she on drugs? Or was I? I thought about just turning back and trying to go back to town, but I still thought it would be better to find her and lead her back. I would just grab her and carry or drag her if necessary. I wasn't gonna let this lady freeze to death while I could do something about it, even if she was apparently levitating. It was then at that point that I realized that I didn't know where I was. In my attempts to get to her, I had lost track of the trail. Well, now I felt stupid. My own footprints, I thought. I turned around and found that my footprints were also gone. My trail now just started where I was standing at the moment. Had the snow filled them in, or was I going crazy? I know for a fact, though, that I wasn't levitating. It was at this revelation that I was becoming afraid. Something was, seriously, wrong here. What could I do now? I didn't know where the lady was anymore, and I didn't know how to get back to town, even if I did find her. This place is a big expanse of forest. It eventually extends back to a mountain range. Unfortunately, the trees were too thick to see the mountains for reference. Where the fuck was I? I could see one thing, however. The sun was starting to go down. The sun goes down pretty early around here. I guess it was a mistake to go out this late, since I figured I would have been home by now. I decided that all I could really do was just start walking the same direction I thought I had come from. I picked the direction that had been directly behind me when I lost sight of the woman. I figured that if I could find the trail, it would be easy. But I felt terrible leaving her that way. But I needed to know where the hell I was before I could effectively help her. I was now considering just rushing home and calling the authorities to be the best available option. But first, I needed to find home. I walked for what felt like hours, through snow and trees, without ever finding the trail. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, similar to my footprints disappearing, or if I had actually gone in the wrong direction. I paused to look around when I noticed a woman walking off in the distance. Relative to where I was, she was at 3:30, about 20 yards away. I stared at her for a few seconds, realizing that she was actually looking at me. The fact that she was looking at me was creepier than when she wasn't. I was frozen in place, too confused to approach her. I knew I needed to help her, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to anymore. All of this seemed so off. She then began taking a few slow steps towards me, to where I was. I don't know why, but I was getting scared now. I took a few steps back to attempt to match the ground she was gaining on me. She didn't seem determined to get to me. In fact, despite looking at me, she didn't seem like she actually noticed me. I was, for some reason, apprehensive to turn away from her and just run. I was still clinging to the idea that this was just some normal woman, out of her mind, on drugs, who also needed my help. My own pace was beginning to slow down. I don't know why, but I wanted to get away from her, for some reason. But my body just wasn't moving the way it should have been. On top of that, I was so cold. It was like ice was forming in my blood, and she was catching up to me pretty quickly. "Ma'am, if you need help, I can help you," I said. "We can get back to town. Lakasalev, you know where that is, right? It's just on the outside of the woods here. Do you want me to help you?" No response. I looked down and noticed that her hands and feet were frostbitten. There was also patches of frostbite all over her body now. Had her condition become more severe? When she got closer, the frostbite was also on her lips, turning them a blue color. Her chest and face were slowly becoming flushed in a frosty blue. "Ma'am, your frostbite is getting worse. We need to get you to town. Here, take my coat," I said. I was actually becoming panicked at her bizarre behavior and this entire situation. There really was something severely wrong here. A large clump of snow fell from a branch above my head and crashed on my head. It didn't hurt, but I had to wipe the snow from my eyes. It took little effort getting it out. I looked up from my struggle to notice her now standing very close to me, nearly 3 feet away. That's when I lost it. I began to will myself away from her. I took off running, not caring which way I was heading anymore. As long as I could get away from that monster, that thing, she wasn't human. Or if she wasn't a normal human. When I looked up at her that time, her body was completely covered in frostbite. Her entire skin was a deep blue color, patches of decay. Her forearms down and her legs on down were skeletal. Her face was mutilated by frostbite. Her ears and nose missing, the rims of her lips missing. Her chest was actually missing entirely, with a large patch of mutilation carved into her chest by frostbite, exposing just a small amount of her rib cage. I was just about out of my mind. I was actually running now. I had no idea where I would end up. I was just hoping to find the edge of the woods before she might have found me. I couldn't tell at all if I was getting closer to safety or further into the woods. Then I kind of wondered if just escaping the woods would be enough. Would she follow me out? I didn't know what to think anymore. That thing, obviously, wasn't human anymore, assuming it ever really was. So I didn't even know if it would conform to human logic. All I could do was cycle through begging not to be found, begging to escape somewhere else, begging to escape somewhere safe, cursing my entire decision to go walking out in the woods, cursing the woods themselves, asking what the hell she was. All of this. It was all I could do while running to avoid going crazy. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it was making the whole thing worse. I ran for what must have been another few hours. And it was dark now. As I was running, I tripped over a root, steered sideways, and slammed my back into a tree. It was now too dark for me to see anything, and I was now too tired to even move. If she were to find me, that's all there was to it. I would have to rest, build up some strength. I backed myself up against the tree I had collided with and stared into the blackness, hoping not to get attacked. I remember the food I brought with me and pulled out my bottle of water. All of the liquid had frozen solid. I found it very strange because I didn't really think it was cold enough for that to happen, especially since it had been in my coat pocket the entire time. Maybe I was going crazy, or maybe I was just losing it. Well, I couldn't drink ice, so I moved on to the trail mix. It was fine and gave me a bit of strength. Stopping to eat actually gave me the chance to try to collect myself. I could really only wonder what the fuck that thing was. Why I was seeing so many weird things going on with the snow and ice. There had to be some kind of connection, but I wasn't about to approach any solid ideas as to what it was. As I sat in the dark, I could hear snow crunching somewhere. It was pitch black, but I could tell it was somewhere to my right. I was too exhausted to move now. All I could really do was sit against the tree and hope she didn't find me, or at least hope that whatever she would do to me wouldn't be too bad. But for some reason I doubted that. When I looked at her back then, she was looking at me for just a second. When I could see what she really was, that frostbitten body, her eyes stayed, but they were glazed over, like she was drugged or something. For just a second, she looked right at me. I can't even think of what she might have wanted to do to me, but I'm not really liking any of my options right now. As I sat there, listening to the distant crunching, I focused so intently. I could feel every single snowflake that was hitting me. They seemed to be getting colder, somehow. The entire forest seemed to be dropping in temperature. I honestly wasn't sure I would live to see her catch me. I might end up freezing first. I was trying to think that maybe I shouldn't just be sitting here, but I couldn't decide which was more dangerous. Walking around hoping not to be found, or sitting in one spot hoping not to be found. I wasn't sure what to do either way. I looked behind the tree to still see nothing in the dark. I was pretty quickly darting my eyes and head around, desperately trying to get a visual on something, anything. I couldn't even see the tree I was leaning against. It must have been a new moon or something. I was so paranoid. I was pretty quickly losing track of time. I had no idea what time it might be, but things were starting to get blurry. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because out of nowhere, I opened my eyes to see broad daylight. In hindsight, I kind of wish I'd been able to stay awake. Even though nothing happened, something easily could have. In fact, whatever that thing was, seemed to have such a good grasp on the woods. I'm actually surprised she didn't find me. The only thing I can really think of is that she must have found me, but thought it would be too easy if I was sleeping when she did it. I looked to my right and saw footprints in the snow. Not a trail, just two footprints, side by side, like somebody was hovering over me, landed right there, and flew away. Was she watching me the entire night? Fuck that. I think that might actually be worse than if she caught me, 'cause now I know she's toying with me. I'm not sure if she considered me more prey or a toy, but I didn't like either option. Now that it was morning and I had rested, I decided I needed to start running again, trying to find the trail, the edge of the woods, anything. Honestly, I was sore as hell from all that running, but I guess I couldn't avoid more of it. I started off at a slow walk, keeping my eyes out for whatever that thing might be. This was a bit difficult, since I wanted desperately to just take off and run. I had to think about where I was going, instead of just zipping around blindly. I thought of looking for moss on trees, since I knew the woods were to the southeast of town. Conveniently, the trees had no moss at all, nor did the nearby rocks. I tried to think back on where the sun set last night, but I wasn't awake to see it rise, and I was running so blindly I didn't notice where it set. The sun was currently to my left, but I didn't know what time it was or what direction that was, so that was worthless. I wish I was an expert tracker. I'm sure some hunter or navigator would be able to get me out of the woods. So now I just had to walk, hoping I was going in the right direction, hoping I wouldn't run into that thing again. I walked for a while, what had to be about 2 hours or so. I still didn't seem to be anywhere near the edge of the woods. I still couldn't see anything. It was mostly just a flat plain of snow with trees all around it. I kind of wish they had put a sign up at the edge of the woods, warning people not to go into it. Then again, I'm pretty sure a sign that said, "Warning, naked zombie lady," would be dismissed as a joke. At this point, I realized I was stupid and just ate a handful of snow. I completely forgot that snow was just fluffy water, and just went without liquid because my water bottle was frozen. I must have been so confused from where I was exhausted that I didn't even think of it. With that refresher, I began to realize I was being followed again. I could hear the snow crunching from behind me again. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. I gazed around, but still couldn't see anything. I needed to hurry up before that thing caught up to me, so I got up and kept moving. It was hours later, and I still didn't see any scenery that looked even remotely unique. I had no idea these woods were this big. I realized that nobody really knew me, so nobody would be looking for me either way. I wasn't really counting on that anyways. Honestly, I just needed to find a way out. At this rate, I wasn't sure if I was just walking in circles or not. I could have been for all I knew. At this point, I realized the sun was hanging low. That must have been west. I knew I needed to go northwest, so all I had to do was head in some direction from there. I didn't know where I would come out, but it was worth a shot, so I started walking. I walked for several more hours in what I assumed was a straight line. It didn't seem to be taking me anywhere. I looked up trying to focus on the sun, trying to see which way I was going. Around then, I turned around to see the path where I was coming from. That's when I saw her, the woman, standing directly across from me. She was far enough away that I couldn't see if there was any frostbite on her this time. She didn't look like it, but she was staring directly at me and walking towards me. I was in a better position this time, or at least I thought. I knew where the hell I was going. I turned left and started running towards the sun. I knew that there was a highway that went through a part of the woods. I wasn't so intent on getting to the highway as my definite destination. If she blocks my path directly to town, I can find some semblance of civilization. I ran for a few minutes before realizing that I had lost her, or at least it looked like I did. I wasn't sure anymore. I knew she could be anywhere. I slowed to a stop and surveyed my surroundings. I couldn't see her anywhere, nor any sign of her. A small amount of sunlight was peeking through the trees now, but I could tell it would most likely be setting within the hour. I had to find my way out before that happened. Otherwise, I would lose my only usable reference point. I took off running again, sprinting through the forest, dodging between trees. I had no idea how long I was running for, maybe 45 minutes, but it was also getting darker. I was losing light and my ability to navigate. I could only try to keep running in a single direction, then just keep going that same way once the sun was down. I felt I had a pretty good system now. Surely, I couldn't get lost if I kept in a straight line. The only thing I really had to worry about was getting interrupted. At that point, I crashed into a tree. I had been running for hours. I must have been tired again. My coat wasn't really protecting me from the environment the way it should have been also. As I slowly rose to my feet, I saw an opening in the trees. It was the trail. I had finally found it again. I climbed back to 2 feet and staggered onto it. I felt a lot better knowing I had found a sign that I was on the right track. I then realized I had something of a conundrum. Should I really follow the trail, or should I keep going in a straight line the way I was? I remember seeing a map of the trail outside, seeing that it wasn't just one trail, but a huge network. I don't remember any specific directions, but I knew that just blindly following the trail might not necessarily be a good idea, especially now that I was already on a good path. I decided the trail could screw itself and kept walking in a straight line. It was also very dark now. I could barely see. I couldn't quite move as quickly as I was before, but I wasn't about to just stop. I didn't trust my safety to that monster. It was now practically pitch black again. I didn't know what time it must have been. I had been switching between walking and running for more than 24 hours now. When the fuck would these woods end? These woods couldn't have been this expansive. They just couldn't have been. I must have been just completely lost at this point. I didn't know what to think at that point, and I still didn't know, to be honest. I was lost in thought, and then I realized the sun went down. The night wasn't quite as dark as the night before, but it was still nearly pitch black. I wouldn't just be running blindly anymore, so I kept walking straight. I felt in front of me for trees, groping blindly like an idiot. I must have looked like one to that sadistic bitch. I went on grabbing at nothing for several hours. It had to be past midnight when I felt something that wasn't natural. I felt a quick brush of a wispy, spiderweb-like form. It was hair. That woman's hair. That thing's hair. I stepped back for a second, looking around in the darkness. I couldn't see her anywhere. I could just barely make out the trees around me. I stood mostly blind, helpless against this monster in the dark. At this point, not being able to see her was worse than actually seeing her. That paranoia that grips you as a little kid in your bedroom, staring at the closet, waiting for the boogeyman to come out and eat you. I finally took a step, not feeling any sign of her anywhere. I kept taking a few very slow steps, trying to make some kind of headway. At this rate, I wasn't sure I would even notice if I was out of the woods or not. I could be standing in a field and I might not really notice. I debunked all of this when I felt the bark of a tree in front of me. I began maneuvering around it, keeping at its base to avoid losing my direction. As I rounded the trunk, I felt something. I felt two icy cold, skeletal hands lightly caressed the sides of my neck. I felt what must have been, whatever the fuck that thing was. Its shredded lips lightly kissed my ear. At that moment, I fucking lost it. I turned around, took a swing, hitting nothing, and turned back, taking off running. Kinda funny how quickly I abandoned my plan of just staying slow. I have no idea what the fuck that thing wanted, but it wouldn't be getting it from me. I sprinted through the woods, occasionally bumping into the edge of a tree, heading where I prayed, which was northwest. I was in a full panic, just barely keeping it together enough to remember where I was supposed to be going. It was a flashback to the night before, where I just ran blindly and got myself lost as I was. At least now, I could hope I had stayed in the right direction this time, but I wasn't banking on it. I had to avoid trees in the dark, hoping that lady wasn't behind me or in front of me. But that might be the thing that made me panic the most. The idea that I would just run right into her in the dark and never see her coming. I couldn't shake that feeling. I never felt like she wasn't right next to me. I knew she was always somewhere close by, watching me, waiting for whatever she wanted from me. At some point in the dark, I suddenly ran right into something. It was low and hard. It seemed to be a big rock. I felt one of my shin bones shatter on contact from how hard I was running, combined with the shape of it. I went flying over it, rode over the top of it, and landed in what seemed to be a collection of smaller rocks. I then started groping my way around before finding my footing. The rocks I was standing on were loose, so I ended up falling again. My hand landed just the right way for me to get an idea of the rock itself. It felt so strange. It actually didn't seem like stone. It was too light for that. I picked it up and felt its shape, discovering it to be a bone. I felt around a bit more and found that all of the small rocks I was laying on were actually bones, some of them clearly human. I began trying to crawl my way out before brushing my head on something metallic. I picked it up, finding it to be an old lighter. I gave it a few clicks to see if it worked. I have no idea if it did, since I was terrible with lighters. I never could get one to light up. As I sat there, I felt something brush against my leg. It was a hand. I jumped back, assuming it was her. As I backed away, I heard what I can only describe as a hoarse, weak, wheezing noise. I grabbed a large rock, crawling over it, attempting to rest for energy. I wasn't sure how well I could do with that busted leg bone. As I sat back, I could hear snow crunching from behind me. I listened carefully, trying to see exactly where it was coming from. How close was it? It was in the bone pile apparently. The footsteps suddenly stopped as I heard total silence for a few seconds. The wheezing kicked back, more panic sounding this time, like a person who had their vocal cords cut desperately, trying to talk. I suddenly began hearing a different crunching noise. It sounded like bone breaking. It sounded like flesh tearing. I didn't know what was worse, what was happening, or what might be happening, and not knowing was killing me. I had to know what it was. Curiosity was driving me crazy, even though I dreaded what the answer to my question might be. Finally, I decided I had to see. I peeked over the rock, seeing nothing but darkness, of course. But then I remembered the lighter. I gave it a few flicks before finally getting the damn thing to light. When I looked down, I saw her. I now saw the full scope of the bone pile. It was huge. It looked almost like one of those mass graves that genocides and massacres have been known to produce. There were some animal bones too, deer, birds, dogs, but it seemed like it was mostly human bones. As I looked closely, I saw tooth marks on the bones. As I looked up, I saw exactly what she was doing, the exact source of that noise. It was a man. It looked to be a middle-aged man, or at least what was left of him. His body was missing from around his stomach down. She was holding his torso up, devouring him. She was biting off organs and flesh, breaking bone with her teeth, where it had once wore its disguise as a normal woman, attempting to maintain a sort of dignity or beauty. All of it had mostly been abandoned. Its mouth opened too wide, mostly due to what seemed to be her cheeks missing as she tore off huge chunks of flesh like an animal. She then looked up at me, giving me a frigid look with those eyes. She glared at me, her female dignity returning. She stood, her mouth covered in frozen blood. The man seemed to be fading quickly. His body was blue from frostbite. I have no idea how he was still alive, but he most likely wouldn't be for much longer. As she approached me, she took further notice of the lighter I carried. She seemed to shy away from me when she saw it, like she was afraid of it, but she still approached me, slowly, inching closer. As she approached, I realized what it was. Everything about her was cold. Her body was cold. Her home was cold. Her victims were cold. Her food was cold, so anything with heat must have been something she can't deal with. As she was within arm's reach, I thrust the lighter at her. She quickly backed away before continuing her approach. I tried this a few more times before realizing that I was right. She couldn't stand heat. At this point, I had a crazy idea that I must have gotten from an action movie. I figured that if she was afraid or weakened by heat, I could set her on fire and possibly be done with her for good. As well as I could, I kept the lighter lit up and gently tossed it at her, reaching right into her hair. Her hair, lightly, catching a slight bit of fire before the lighter faded out onto the ground. I couldn't see what was happening, just embers coming from her, apparently burning her hair. I didn't want to stick around. This thing didn't seem to be very mortal, so I didn't want to risk the idea that I had only pissed it off. As best as I could with my busted up leg, I took off running, which actually wasn't very fast, more like limping away, but it was fast enough. I didn't see any really convincing signs that she was following me, but I'll never be sure. Everything after that is just kind of blurry. I have no clue how long I must have been running. It seemed almost like I must have fallen asleep while running, because suddenly I was reaching the highway, staggering out onto the pavement and collapsing. At this point, I blacked out. What happened between then and when I woke up in the hospital was extremely fuzzy. I must have been picked up by somebody at some point, but I don't remember who they were or when they came along. What I do remember was coming to my senses for a few seconds in somebody's car, or it might have been the cab of a truck. The person asked me who I was, and I answered. They asked me what I was doing out in the woods and what happened to me. For all I know, I blacked out again before I could answer. I woke up in the hospital in the afternoon. The doctors and police were asking me what happened to me. I didn't mention the bones, fearing that by doing so, I would end up sending some police officers to their death. I just told them that I had gone for a walk in the woods and became hopelessly lost. One officer asked me about the marks on my body. Apparently, when the woman touched me, she left marks of frostbite on my neck in the shape of skeletal hands. That's when I told them that I had no idea how that came to be. They didn't really seem to press the issue after that. I got home a few days later. I started my job a few days after that. I wasn't really that great in Norwegian, but had a passing knowledge of it. I asked a few coworkers about the woods, about that forest. An older guy told me about the woods being haunted by something, but he didn't really elaborate, and I don't think I really needed him to, since I knew all that I needed to know about it. On some occasions, I feel like I'm still sometimes back there. When I get a sudden chilly draft in my house, and the feeling that I'm being watched. Even in the summer, even after I have moved out the country, which once again for work, the frostbite she left on my neck left a very visible scar. It still does hurt a little bit, especially on cold, snowy days. I don't recommend ever going there, not even for a second. I don't know what that thing was, where she came from, or if she even survived my attack. I was lucky to have gotten away, because I know that if I hadn't found that lighter, I would most likely have ended up the same as that guy. I do still warn you though, that if you ever do decide to go, I can't promise that you'll do any better than I did. And to all the men out there, if you ever see a naked woman out in the woods, don't ever approach her. As a matter of fact, run, turn the other way, and run opposite of her as fast as you can. This is not a story, but a real life event that actually happened to me. I live in a small town in Kentucky where there is nothing, no hope, no jobs, and nothing but churches all around. I was at church one night, and this preacher put his hand on my head and prayed that God would reveal himself to me. He then went on to the next person to pray. I got up and started walking towards the exit of the church. All the jumping and shouting was scaring me, and honestly, it feels nothing of God. It seems like it's more the perks kicking in than anything else. As I left out the door, I went outside to smoke. I walk around the building, and there's a little creek behind the church, so I ended up walking back behind there. As I was standing out there, smoking a cigarette, the hair stood up on my neck, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. I noticed across the creek, in between a bunch of trees, was a pair of red eyes. But they didn't seem scary, nor evil. They just seemed curious, interested. I stared back at it, and it felt like we were staring for hours, but it was just a few minutes. There was nothing, no movement, no blinking, nothing. I then heard somebody walking behind me. I turned back, and I saw it was another person who was also coming outside to smoke a cigarette. As I turned back around, the creature, or this thing, was gone. After talking and smoking, we both went back into the church, and I never saw the eyes again. I still wonder what that thing was, whatever it was. It couldn't have been an angel or God. I'm starting to think it was the devil waiting outside the church. To give you a little more insight about me, this story happened when I was 14 years old. I was at my friend Emily's house, since back then I lived there for personal reasons. Anyways, it was about 1 a.m. and her parents were gone for the night. We were watching scary movies and eating out on snacks like we usually would every weekend night. After our movie, I got up to go to the restroom, and I let my friend know that I would be back. She nodded before opening up her laptop to message her boyfriend at the time. As I walked down the dark hallway and I was coming across the bathroom, I heard my friend's voice call out to me, but it was coming from the back porch that was on the right side of the hallway, which immediately struck me as odd because I never seen her leave the room or even walk past me. And why would she be outside anyways at this time? Her voice called out to me again, so I couldn't help it but walk out to the back porch. It does take a lot to scare me after all, so I wasn't bothered by this. As it turns out, it was the biggest mistake ever. A red flag should have went off right then and there when her voice became silent as I stepped outside. I called her name softly, but she didn't reply. I called her name once more, but this time, louder. And again, nothing but silence. I stepped off the porch into the grass looking into her wooded backyard, a little pissed off now because at that time, I figured she was trying to prank scare me, like she always was. It was a normal thing for her, but when I yelled her name again, a voice spoke. But it wasn't hers, it was another woman's voice. "Help me, please, for the love of God, help me." Okay, now I was officially freaked out because there was no one around for miles besides her one neighbor that lives a little ways into the woods. I found myself not being able to move. Curiosity maybe? But the bushes started rustling and what looked like a dog stepped out. At first I thought it was her neighbor's dog that must have gotten out again because it has happened before. But when this thing stood up on its hind legs, it was about 7 feet tall. That's when I really froze up. What the hell was this thing? I asked myself. I never met any human that's this tall in my entire life. Then it started to move towards me. It was walking kind of like a human, but wobbling like a baby taking its first steps. I found myself not being able to move, to get out of there like I should have. That is, until I heard the slider door being opened, and the real Emily's voice speak. "Lana, what are you doing outside? I looked around my whole house for you." As soon as she finished her sentence, I ran inside as fast as I could and pulled my friend inside before shutting the door and locking it while closing the blinds. I did this to every room, even the basement, locking all the windows included. All the while, Emily yelling at me, asking me what the fuck was going on. I took her arm and raced into her room before slamming her door behind us. When she finally realized how terrified I was and how badly I was shaking, only then did she ask me, "Jesus, Lana, what's the matter? You look like you just seen a ghost." I finally calmed down enough to begin to tell her what I encountered, but before I got the chance to fully explain what happened, I heard extreme banging on my friend's window, which shocked us both and we both shot up at least 10 feet in the air. I whispered, "Fuck." I realized I forgot to shut the blinds. I didn't have the heart to turn around, but when Emily's face went pale, I didn't have a choice but to look behind me. I really wish I hadn't. There, that thing was, looking into our bedroom window. I couldn't even begin to explain what it looked like. All I can come up with is that its body was twisted like someone that had just been in a freakish car accident, and it had fur, lots of it, and the eyes glowed much like a cat. A high-pitched noise escaped that thing's throat, making us not only cover our ears, but we both screamed as hard as our lungs would let us. I threw my friend on the floor before zooming into her parents' room to get her dad's .42 rifle. But when I came back, the noise stopped and that creature was gone. Emily was rocking back and forth, holding her knees close to her, shaking and crying. She saw its face as clear as I did. The rest of the night, we had all the lights on in the house, and we stayed huddled together in the living room with the rifle right under my legs. Finally, after what seemed like years, the sun rose and her parents walked through the door. Instantly, her dad noticed our fear-stricken expressions and his gun under my legs. They sat down and softly asked both of us what happened. When I explained it, they shared worried glances before announcing that we were moving. We never asked why. We were just happy to get the hell out of there. We moved that exact day to my family's vacation home in a very populated city with little to no trees. When my own parents got home and we told them, they had the same reactions. And they told me I could never go out after dark alone and to stay away from wooded areas. Of course, I never questioned it. And to this day, I don't know if it was a skinwalker that some people believe in, or if it was an imposter. What I do know, though, that it was not human. My mom recently shared a strange and creepy experience that she and her siblings and parents witnessed when she was younger, at around 6 years of age. My mom is not the type of person to lie about this just to scare someone. And also, my aunts and uncles have verified the story individually. My grandparents, mother, aunts, and uncles lived in a small pueblo, a small town, in Mexico with a population of about 1,000 people. They were all scattered throughout the landscape. They lived at the bottom of one of the larger cerros, or hills, that would take a couple of hours to get to the very top. My abuelitos were very poor. My grandfather was making just enough to provide for their necessities by working at a sugarcane field. But yet they were living in one of the nicer homes because of its proximity to the hill and what everyone would say, a witch's house at the top of that hill. Everybody around there stayed away from that house, and the rent was the cheapest there was out of everything else, out of all the other houses that were available. My abuelitos, grandparents, tias y tios, aunts and uncles, and my mom had some paranormal experiences in that house. Most of these were attributed to the witch in typical Mexican folklore fashion. This thing that they witnessed, however, was what made them leave. Mi madre, my mom, says that one day she was inside at the entrance of the home with the door wide open, playing with some toys. My tios and tias, aunts and uncles, were in the same room behind her also, while my abuelito was relaxing on a rocking chair in that room. She said she was playing and the door to the house was open. As she looked up, as a medium-sized black dog was walking along the road in front of the home. What spooked her was that this dog had 2 human breasts hanging from its chest that were connected to its skin as if it was part of its body. She says that the breasts were hairless, which allowed her to see that they were indeed the breast of a human and not some sort of tumor on the dog. My mom says that the dog instantly gave her a very bad feeling and she started to cry. My mom's crying then caused the dog to stop in its tracks and look into the doorway towards my mom. That's when my grandfather got up and headed towards the door, as so did my uncles, to see what was happening. He instantly recognized what the creature was and pulled out a small gun he always carried with him because of the long treks he made on foot to his job. He aimed the gun and tried pulling the trigger, but the gun kept jamming and would not fire. He tried it a few times, each time checking and making sure the gun was in proper working order, but it simply would not fire. All the while, the dog was just standing there, watching. The dog eventually turned and started running down the road and into some overgrowth along the side of the road. After it disappeared from view, my grandfather tried shooting his gun and it fired without a hitch. Even though they were very limited financial-wise, they moved out within a week after this encounter. Unfortunately, both of my grandparents passed when I was very young, so I cannot ask them about this event. I also never heard of skinwalkers partially changing, turning, and I found this story quite interesting. Sometimes, when we gather together as a family, joking and playing and having a good time, I tell my mom to bring up this story just to give everybody a spook. In a quick summary, that she saw a black dog with human breast hanging from its chest. Grandfather's firearm jammed when he was trying to fire at the dog, and then the gun started working perfectly fine once this dog ran away. Most of my family, when they hear this story, believe it was the bruja, the witch, who lived on top of the cerro, the hill, who apparently, they always say, was a nagual. My mom told me about an experience that she had when she encountered a nagual in the place where my mom grew up. She said that a group of town people were saying that they were seeing a large black bird out at night and it was creeping people out. So one day, some guys got in a truck and encountered the large black bird in the middle of the road following them. One guy took a shot at it and they said that the bullet went through its wing and it flew away. But they recall that when they shot it, they heard the scream, the wail of a woman. Later on, they noticed that an old lady who lived in an isolated home by herself all of a sudden had her arm in a sling and she had a wound from a gunshot. She had already been suspected of being a bruja or a nagual, and they believed that this incident confirmed it. I'm not Navajo or Native or even Indian, but I have a skinwalker story, so here it goes. I go along with a friend to check out his grandfather's Hogan. For those who don't know, a Hogan is basically an old traditional Navajo dwelling place, mostly made out of logs and mud, with a door traditionally facing east. Anyways, his grandfather is in the hospital for a spell. My friend says that his grandfather had an accident there on the property. We get to the place and we're hanging out for a while, drinking some beers and sharing a blunt, when out of nowhere, my friend goes real still and puts his finger up to his lips like he wants me to be quiet. I hear this shuffling noise coming from just outside, and just an FYI, my friend has dark skin. So as I look at him, his face turns several shades more pale. The shuffling noise becomes more loud, as if someone is coming towards the door. My friend grabs a piece of burning firewood out of the stove. He goes over to the door and hurls it out in front of the Hogan. We then hear it hit the ground, and immediately there is this high-pitched laughter, something like the Wicked Witch of the West. Every hair on my body stands up. My friend starts yelling out in some native language. All I can do is pull out my pocket knife and hold it up to be ready. The person outside just keeps laughing, and I finally get the cojones to move over towards the door and peek out. My heart nearly jumps out of my chest. Only several feet from me is this skinwalker. It's leaning up against the wall just to the right, thin and scraggly, covered with these animal skins, and staring back at me with these eyes like black marbles. I'm convinced it's a woman, as I see what looks to be breasts beneath the skins, but thin and sagging, like she's really old. Her face is covered with splotches of hair, and I can't tell if it's real or some kind of get-up. I let out a bit of scream, though I hate to admit it, and it just turns and jogs off towards the hills to the other side of the Hogan. That's the only time I've seen a skinwalker since, and I hope I never see one again. To start this off, there are 0 bears, moose, or elk where I lived at the time. At the time I was around 12 or 14, and I was with my friend, who I will call Kayla. We planned on going on a picnic around her fields. As we walked up a smaller hill, Kayla pushed me to the ground and whispered, "Do you see that?" At least 20 or so feet away, there was a dark figure. It was standing on 4 thin limbs, and its head was narrow, similar to a horse or a deer, but it was completely black. I couldn't make out the features, but it had a mane like a lion. The mane-like fur ran along its back, stopping near the rear, and it also had no tail. Here's a side note: all of the cattle were moved to a completely different area, nowhere near this one, so no other livestock animals were in those fields. But this thing was just staring off. Suddenly, my friend stood up and made a rush for the exit that was at least 2 miles away. I didn't hesitate to follow her. We finally stopped near the latch fence that leads to where she stays at, and we looked back. It was slowly walking back into the trees. This sight, to this day, still gives me chills. I guess I'll start with a background. I'm a 33-year-old female, but the story takes place when I was a teenager, living in the suburb of Chicago. The village I lived in was quiet and middle class. We lived like a mile from the police station, and the worst crimes we had was a murder or 2 and robbery once in a blue moon. 99% of the time, boring and more boring. Unless you had a car, you were stuck just walking around the park at night with your friends, which was kind of boring. But anyways, one night, my girlfriend and I decided to go hang out at a park with some guys at like 12 a.m. The night was a bit windy and had a full moon. I even got a kiss that night from the boy that I liked, but the night wasn't just fun and hanging out late. There's a deep forest in the park with a stream with a playground right next to it. The same playground we went to with swings and jungle gym columns. There's a bridge, the one that everyone uses, and another bridge made of rocks that's barely used because it's deeper in the forest. They're both over the stream, connecting the forest and park area. I'll get to the rock bridge in a minute. We hung around on the swings and chatted and just spent the evening together. I'm sitting down and just looking around, talking and enjoying the peace and quiet and the moonlight. I have a full view of the forest. I then see something moving deep in the woods, some dark shape. It looked like it was crawling out of the forest, an arm, then another arm. Then it pulls itself out of the stream. This figure happens to be darker than the surrounding forest. As I'm just sitting there, frozen, I think I'm seeing things. And it just kind of lays there on the ground, but it doesn't move. A flash of fear comes across me. What if it comes this way? I then look over to my friends, and no one notices anything. I look back, and it's gone. Did it go back or go somewhere? At this point, I really want to get out of there. Then, one of my friends is asking all of us, "Did you guys hear about the urban legend of the rock bridge over the stream? Apparently, some kids or something played on the bridge and fell over and died." What a thing to say after what I saw, but I didn't ask anyone anything and just pretended that I never saw anything. But this experience stuck with me. I never talked about it because it must have been my imagination. Things like that only happen in scary movies, right? After all of this, I rarely went to the park after that. Who knows what would have happened if this black thing saw me the same time that I saw it. I live right next to a Navajo reservation and have made friends with many of the people there my age. We like to hang out, play video games, and just be normal teens. I walk over a lot since my best friend lives a little less than a mile away from me. This isn't a long trek, and it only takes about 25 to 30 minutes. I have made this trip dozens of times and have grown very comfortable with it. I know the people along the way, so I'm not scared or on edge. There is a patch of forest, however, about midway there. It's a little unnerving sometimes. There's always that feeling of being watched. This was a regular occurrence for me, so I try to just ignore it and shake it off as my mind playing tricks on me. This day, I spent more time at my friend's house than I meant to, and when I left, it was already getting dark. I reached the stretch of forest right as the sun disappeared from the sky. I shivered a little as I readied myself to begin the journey through. I was 10 steps in when I heard a branch snap. You know the sound, the one that screams, "There is definitely someone or something there with you." I froze, not sure what I should do next. Should I run? Should I turn around and book it back to my friend's house? I didn't know the best option in this situation, so I whispered, "Hello?" Hearing my voice crack as the words fell from my lips, I don't know why I even opened my mouth, but it was out there, so I listened for any reply. My heart sank when the answer came back in the sound of my voice. "Hello?" My heart pounded against my chest. I felt like I was gonna faint. "Hello?" My voice came again, but not from my mouth. I wanted to run, but my feet felt cemented to the ground. I couldn't scream. I couldn't reply. "Hello? Hello? 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 Hello?" as my voice echoed over and over from a short distance away. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere around me. "Hello? Hello? 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 Hello?" It repeated. "Stop it!" I finally managed to tear from my lips. Everything went silent. For a long minute, nothing happened. The air grew stale, and I realized for the first time that there was no typical forest sound. There were no bugs, no frogs, or crickets. Nothing. I stood there, terrified, waiting to see what would happen next. "Stop it!" it mimicked back. I had enough and was willing my heavy legs to move. Before I could take a step, I heard some rustling in the bushes 20 feet to my left. I watched as a deer head with huge antlers protruded through the bush as it came further out and stood up on twos. I took off. I flew out of the woods and all the way home in record time. I said nothing to my mom when I got there. I just went up to my room, laid down, and thought about what happened. My mom came in at some point and asked me if everything was alright. I replied yes, I was just tired. I don't know why I didn't tell her. I guess I was afraid of how she would react. I called my friend and told him everything. He freaked out and told me that no matter what happened that night, to not reply or look out my window. But this terrified me even more. He said to call him the next morning and he would explain more, and that he had to speak to his grandfather as soon as possible. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, listening to every little sound the night brought. Around 3 a.m., just as I was about to drift off, the air changed. The night sounds got quiet. I felt my heart begin to pound. I lay there and waited, pulling the covers over my head like a child, far too scared to move. It came after a long moment. "Hello?" I cried. It was all I could do. "Hello? Stop it!" It mocked what I had said in the woods again. It was terrifying enough when it copied what I said. But then, it did something new. It called my name. "Amy." My mother's voice. "Amy! Amy! Come here! Hello? Stop it!" My voice again. For the rest of the night, the creature outside my window called my name in my mother's voice and repeated what I said in the woods over and over. In the morning, when the sun broke through the dark, it finally stopped. I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up around 12 to my friend calling to tell me he had spoken to his grandfather and could explain what happened to me. He said there was a creature that they called yenaglooshi, or he who goes on all fours, or a skinwalker. He explained that it was an evil witch that used dark magic to transform into an animal with the attributes it required, and that this witch had caught my scent and knew me now. I was also given a warning that since it knew me, it would always follow me, and that I would always have to be careful. Last night, I heard scratching on my window, then a low hum. The creature began saying my name again, but also adding in things I hadn't said in my mother's voice. At one point, it started calling my name, but drawing it out really far, like "Amy." It tried to get me to come outside or to open the door and let it into my house. This went on all night. At this point, I feel like I'm going crazy. I don't know what to do. Is this thing seriously going to stalk the shadows around me for the rest of my life? I don't think I can take that. Many of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word nagual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latin America, we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night. I remember because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house in a small pueblo or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately. They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away, you have nothing to do here. Leave this house. My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock, he picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a Nahuatl. He told us he spoke to that man and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. I saw some videos about skinwalkers on TikTok, so I started watching videos about them on YouTube, and there was a whole podcast where this guy just read stories about them from Reddit and other stories that people submitted. Our ward at church purchased a piece of land way back in the day. It's seriously just wooded area with a little bit of swamp. We would always go there for campouts and scouts, and at night, when it was pitch black, we would all play manhunt. Well, one time, we all got down to one person whose name was David. Growing up, he was super fast, and he would hide really good, so nobody could ever find him. He would always end up being the last person. Well, one time, it was down to David, and we had split up and gone way deep in the forest towards the swamp because it seems like it was impossible to find him. We thought he might have gone a little bit further than we normally go. We started getting into some more muddy and wet terrain as we get closer to a swamp-like area where the water is most likely shin deep. And we saw David way out in the swamp, and he wasn't wearing a shirt. And with the spotlight on him, he looked super pale, but he just stood there and didn't say a word. You could seriously tell something was off. Then, all of a sudden, we heard David from behind us, yelling, trying to get our attention, so we would keep trying to chase him down. Meaning, what we saw in front of us was definitely not him. So being a bunch of 12 to 17-year-old boys, we started yelling and running back to the campsite as fast as we could. Nobody believed us. In fact, for years everybody made fun of it, calling the ghost of David. But then I started listening to these stories, and every single one of them sounds just like what happened in some way or another.